They are defined by Wikipedia as a type of harmful witch who has the ability to turn into, possess, or disguise themselves as animals. The following is a compilation of 66 skinwalker sightings I've recorded, all together in one 5-hour video for your viewing pleasure. Also, as a thank you for 300,000 subs, I've included a download link in the description so you can take this extra long feature on the prowl. Thank you, and enjoy. Black Figure, submitted by Brit. My name is Brittany. I'm 13 years old and I'm your average teenager. Lately I've been seeing these black figures, and it all started way back in 2012. My dad worked at a dairy farm, and the farmers he worked for let him live on site in a trailer that wasn't too fancy. It really all began when his boss told him that one of his coworkers wanted to trade houses, basically a house swap. So of course my dad asked why, and his boss told him that the coworker said he has been seeing spirits and it has been creeping him out, so his family wanted to move out. Eventually my dad agreed and they swapped houses. The first night I slept there though, I felt like something was watching me. But I just assumed it was normal for me to feel alone and scared because in all the other houses I lived, I shared a room with my sister, and now we both had our own rooms. So I wasn't used to being alone like this. That's why it was easy to shrug it off, and eventually I went to sleep. A week later, everything felt normal and everything was just happy. But that was before I saw something. I saw this black figure just outside my bedroom window, and it scared the hell out of me. I ran out of my room and into my sister's, and she asked what the heck was going on. I said I saw something. Then I thought about it, and when she asked what it was, I told her it was just a scary bug. I didn't want to seem like a wimp or paranoid. 1 year later, we moved out to this new house right by the reservation at that time. I didn't know about skinwalkers and all that crazy stuff, and when I saw these black figures, I got scared, and I would just shrug it off like normal. I mean, I didn't know what they were. And so far, I was the only one seeing them. A week later, my sister said she saw one of these black figures. It was right across the road, and it had red, glowing eyes. I was very creeped out, because I never once told her about the black figures I saw, but I've never heard of them having those red eyes before. 1 week after that, my sister and I stayed up all night hoping to scare the hell out of my dad when he came home. He worked night shift, and he would get home around 5 in the morning. So my dad pulls in the driveway that night. The first thing we notice is that he's driving way faster than usual. We saw him literally run up to the door, and we could hear the keys jingling around on the outside, like he was in a straight-up panic or something. It sounded like something beat us to scaring him. He opened the door, and my sister continued with the prank, jumping out at him and trying to surprise him. My dad literally screamed and almost punched her. I turned on the light at the right moment, because if I didn't, I'm sure my dad would have knocked her out. Then we asked him what was wrong. He said that when he was driving home, he saw this tall creature standing on all fours. He thought it was a coyote, but as he drove closer to it, he saw that it was far too large and tall to be one, and he drove out of there as fast as he possibly could. So then me and my sister got a little freaked out. And honestly, I'm starting to think that all of these sightings are connected somehow. Maybe they're all the work of the skinwalkers. Skinwalker at my door. Submitted by the Miraculous Fox. I've always had a sort of draw to the supernatural, and this story is about an encounter I had with a skinwalker. I live in southern New Jersey, very close to the Pine Barrens, home of the Jersey Devil. I'm sure you've heard of him. My backyard is pretty big. It has a large deck and a pretty big fenced-in yard. The fence backs up to a wooded area. There was always deer running around back there, owls, and even bats. On this particular night, I awoke out of a deep sleep to a tapping noise on my window. I had to have been about 8 years old at the time, and the constant presence of spirits in my room was enough for me to be too scared to investigate any sort of noise in the middle of the night. So I stayed put, just shivering under my covers, not quite sure what to do. I peeked through the blankets just enough to see what looked like a tall, thin figure standing at my window. You see, my room was in the middle of my house, and my window faced the wooded area just behind it. I waited a couple of minutes, and the tapping eventually stopped. Then, not a moment later, I heard a voice calling my name, a familiar voice. It was my mother's, but at the same time it wasn't. It sounded so scripted. I heard more tapping and the voice still calling. But the voice slowly drifted to the back door. The back door was in the kitchen, and it led out to the deck. I mustered the courage to get up, and I tiptoed to the edge of the kitchen doorway. I know I saw a figure at the back door window in the shape of a woman. It was tapping at the glass and calling my name in my mother's voice still.
"Kelly dear, please let me inside,"
that thing said to me. It sounded as if it was projecting the voice straight into my head. I was a smart kid though. I tiptoed to my mother's room and I quietly opened the door. And there she was in bed, softly snoring. I noped my way right back into bed and I hid under my covers. Sure enough, the tapping at my window started again, but I did not dare look. Eventually, I fell asleep to the tapping, and when I woke up in the morning, I told my mom what had happened. She frowned at me and rubbed my head, sighing. "You have such an imagination," she smiled, and continued doing whatever she was doing. I went outside the next day in the morning, and there were footprints on the ground where my window was. I showed my mom, yet she was still skeptical, but she let me sleep in her bed that night, and we said a prayer together before we went to sleep. That was the only time that ever happened. I hope I never have to see that thing again, the thing that I believe was a skinwalker. My experience with a skinwalker. Submitted by Anonymous. I've never been a person to think that skinwalkers are real. That is, until 1 week ago. Last week I went camping with my mom. We were at Strawberry, Arizona, if I remember correctly. We were going to be camping for the weekend, starting Friday night to Sunday afternoon. We arrived at about 6 o'clock and it was already dark. My mom started a small fire and we got working on putting up our tents. We were done about 30 minutes later. We had our dinner, some s'mores, and went to bed. I woke up at 10. I needed to go use the bathroom, so I got out a flashlight and went to pee. A few moments later, I began to walk back to my tent. I heard something scratching on what I assumed was wood. I stopped and I looked around, but there was nothing there. I jogged back to my tent and got in, and only a few moments later, that scratching came again, but it was closer now, way closer. After a minute or two, it went away, and I went to sleep a few minutes later. I was awoken to a loud screech. It sounded like it was within 20 feet of us. I didn't dare go out there with whatever that thing was. I was still half asleep, so I turned on my flashlight and I pointed it to the walls of the tent. Big mistake. It was attracted to the light and it walked towards it. I saw the silhouette of the thing come into view. It was a very large figure. Everything about it seemed human at first, and then I noticed the fingers on this thing. They looked to be claws. The height of it was larger than any person I've ever seen, and its legs weren't human either. There looked to be a fur about them, as if it was some sort of goat. It started scratching on my tent, creating holes in it. I saw a part of the tall figure. Its legs were, as I described before, goat-like. I did what anyone would do in this situation. I screamed. The thing scratched at my leg, and then the creature started to shrink. This is the best way I can describe it. And only a moment later, it took on the form of a wolf. But still, on its back legs, the thing took off. Immediately, I got a first aid kit, and I wrapped my leg up. The damage wasn't too bad. The cut itself wasn't that deep, but it did bleed for a while. After that, I got out of my tent and went to my mom's. I told her that we needed to leave now. And within 15 minutes, everything was in the car, and we drove out of that place. It was probably 3 in the morning whenever this happened, and we made it home only a couple of hours later. Run. Submitted by Alex. This is an account of something that occurred 2 years ago now, something that cannot be logically explained to this day. I live in northern Illinois in a nice neighborhood. There's good people and a pretty boring atmosphere. Normally, nothing weird ever happens around here, but this is a definite exception to say the least. Me and my friend, let's call her Anna, were hiking in the woods around the lake near my house. Now it's the middle of winter, mind you. The woods aren't that thick, and the lake is surrounded by city and condos. It's not remote or anything, and that fact is what makes what happened to us all the more terrifying. So Anna and I were exploring a section of the lake that's closed off from the rest, due to it being private property. It was the dead of winter, and as the sun set, we were armed only with our wits and some flashlights. We were searching for the presence of the small wolf pack or coyotes that had taken up residence here. Initially, we found nothing, but it was expected as wild animals tend to stay away from humans. It had just snowed, so if there were any tracks, they would only be minutes old, and after about 10 minutes of scanning the snow, I came upon a set of canine tracks. The interesting thing about these tracks, though, was that they were absolutely massive, reaching the overall width of my splayed hand, but otherwise identical to a normal wolf. After seeing that, instead of hightailing it the hell out of there like any sane person, I decided to ignore the overwhelming feeling of dread, and I called Anna over to me. As we both looked in awe at the tracks, I remembered that I had my phone with me, and so I began taking pictures of the prints in comparison of my hand. I wanted to prove what we saw to my family once we got back home, if we survived. After taking an obsessive amount of photos, I suggested that we follow the direction of the tracks. Anna agreed, and so we followed them, going northwest across the property. This section of woods is used as a private dump by the landowner, and the tracks were leading directly to the small, flimsy trailer used as its on-site office. As we continued on, I began to get this feeling like we were being watched, but it was like nothing I've ever felt before. This was bone-chilling dread, like something was listening to my very heartbeat. I ignored the danger alarm sounding in the back of my mind, and I continued looking down at the tracks that had now begun to morph before my eyes. These prints were now getting even larger, and the toes began to elongate on both the front and hind feet. I froze, panic taking over for a moment, and I turned to Anna. I said to her, "Come over here, look at this. Are you seeing what I'm seeing right now?" Anna came over and looked at me with wide eyes before pulling out her phone to take more pictures. Despite the darkness, the cold, and now the danger of some creature lurking nearby, we trudged on with our investigation. Soon we were almost upon the trailer, about 300 feet away, when again the tracks morphed, this time becoming longer and becoming bipedal. The elongated canine feet were longer than my forearm and hand, not including its toes, making whatever the canine monstrosity was over 6 feet tall easily. Again, we took pictures, but this time more hastily, shaking the whole time and tears burning behind our eyes. Then Anna asked, "When are we going to leave?" Every fiber of my being told me to run in the opposite direction, and yet we stood there partially frozen in place. That's when the noises began. To our right, in the thicker part of the forest, branches began to break. I turned to Anna, and I said, "I think we should go now." With that, we began walking away, but it was short-lived. As soon as we started walking, whatever inhabits that lake, it knocked over a small tree, uprooting it completely. The sound terrified us and drove us to sprint towards the bent fence that leads out to my street. As we ran, there were solid footsteps behind us. Neither of us dared to look back, and we flew over the uneven ground, unleashing curses as we did so. Once we made it to the small hill where the fence lay bent, Anna scrambled up and leapt to the other side. I bounded up the hill, but ended up falling down over the fence onto the pavement of the street, getting up as fast as possible. "Alex, get up, run!" Anna screamed at me as she looked back at whatever was behind us. And with that, I shot back up to my feet, and we rocketed down the block. We busted through my door into the kitchen and sat down at my table, shaking and panting. My little brother came out to see what the commotion was, and my father soon followed, asking us what the hell just happened. I couldn't speak, so I just handed him my phone so he could look at the pictures we took. He was astonished and told us not to go back there again, especially at night. There are times where I still wonder, what if we didn't run? And that haunts me and Anna to this day. I still don't know what Anna saw behind us that night, and I'm kind of afraid to ask. Baker Lake Skinwalker Thing. Submitted by A. One time, me, my sister, my mom, and her boyfriend went camping around 4 hours from our house. We've gone camping well over 40 times before at least, so I have a bit of experience. Me and my mom's boyfriend, let's call him Chris, arrived before my mom and sister. Let's call my sister Leela. This wasn't much of a problem because everyone knew the area very well. So Chris and I did the usual. We gathered firewood and set up the equipment. I was pretty big for my age, and it took a lot for me to get cold. So people knew if I complained about it being cold, everyone else was already freezing. I am an avid hunter, and I'm very protective of my friends and family. So around 10 o'clock at night, when I was just about to go to sleep, my mom, Leela, and my 3 dogs arrived at the campsite. My mom asked me to help unload some stuff, and once we did, not too long after, we went to sleep. Me and my dog Lucy woke up at the same time, somewhere around 3 in the morning. Believe me when I say it was freezing cold. But not a few seconds after waking up, I heard a distorted voice of my mom saying,
"Come help me."
I was extremely tired, and I didn't want to. I knew I'd get in trouble if I didn't, though. This was a big mistake. I put my shoes on and I looked up to the cars, expecting to see my mom, and even though my vision was a bit blurry still, I saw something black and hairy hunched over on top of my car. I thought it was a bear, and in fear I pulled out the knife in my sheath. I was about to start yelling at the thing to ward it off when it started laughing at me. I froze. My dog began to growl and the creature stood up, and it mimicked Lucy's growl. She whimpered. Then this creature jumped from the car to 7 feet in front of me and let out a shriek so loud that my head hurt. I could hear everyone else waking up in their tents. Chris came out seconds later with his loaded gun. This thing looked at him. Half asleep as well, Chris shot at the thing, and before I knew it, it had run off back into the woods. We ended up calling for help. This thing had scared the hell out of all of us. Even if it was just a bear, this thing was really close and threatened us, basically. When the Fish and Wildlife Services got there, they took whatever samples they could find. We never really got an answer. But being Native American, I've always heard stories, so the word skinwalker quickly came to mind on our way home. It stayed with me for a week. Submitted by Pyrocaster. Now, before I start this, I need to make this clear. I was 11 years old at the time. I was a very plain and uninteresting guy all around. I haven't had any other experiences with creatures or the paranormal since this. And another thing, this lasted an entire week. What I'm about to tell you guys lasted from Monday all the way to the next Sunday. This happened over 8 years ago. I was in 6th grade at the time, and it was about midway through the year. We were all stressed, since the dreaded midterms were upon us, and none of us were prepared. So all of our minds were completely addled from the random questions we were going to have to do. The day went by as uneventful as usual, save for teachers telling us to get ready and whatnot. School ended, and I decided that I was going to do anything that night to relax, thanks to the annoying teachers constantly pestering us about those tests. I went home and watched some TV. A few movies later, it was time to go to bed. And this is when it started. I was tucked into bed since I was a complete mama's boy, and tried to go to sleep after the door was shut. Soon after, I heard the TV downstairs turn on, telling me my mom had sat down to watch TV. I tried to go to bed, but something was off. No sooner had I heard the TV turn on, I stopped hearing it, and I stopped hearing any other sort of noise coming from downstairs. This could usually be chalked up to my mom just going to bed. However, she would always turn the lights off. I could tell she hadn't gone to bed because I could still see all the lights on from under my door. As I wondered why I could no longer hear her, or anything from downstairs for that matter, I started to feel like I couldn't breathe. Scared, I tried to get up and move, call for help, to do anything to get someone's attention. I found out I couldn't move or make any sound, regardless of how hard I tried. My mouth would open, but nothing would come out. I strained to move, but it felt like my muscles had been paralyzed. They wouldn't respond to what I wanted them to do. As I lay there trying to get someone's attention, I saw it. There, by the closet door, was that thing. It was large, not muscular, it was actually very skinny, and I could almost see its bones. But its height was what grabbed my attention right off the bat. It was probably 6 or 7 feet tall, as it was clinging onto the door and was hunching slightly so as to not hit the ceiling. It had very pale skin. However, I could not make out any details on it exactly. Not that night anyways. The last thing I noticed about it was it had no face. It was just a blank slate, devoid of any features and devoid of any kind of hint as to why it was there. I looked at this thing, feeling what I imagine is a primal instinct that is found in anything that looks into something like this. It was fear. Not the kind of fear you get when you see your parents get into a fight. Not the kind of fear you have when looking at a wild predator, really. No, this is what I would imagine. The kind of fear you feel when you know that your life is at the whim of something altogether completely, horribly wrong. This thing stayed there, on the door, for hours. It never moved, not so much as an inch. It just stayed there and did nothing, just like how I could do nothing. As the hours passed and as the fear settled in, I could think to some degree. I realized that I had no idea what I was going to do. Mom would come in at 6:30 to wake me up, and this thing was still there, not making a sound or movement. The time was drawing nearer to when she was supposed to come and wake me up, and I began to panic. I tried to move, but I was still in that paralyzed state. I tried to scream, and nothing would come out. However, I could still see under my door, and I noticed that a shadow was walking up the stairs and towards it. I still couldn't do anything, but as the door opened and I glanced over to it, I immediately looked back, and that thing on the closet was gone. It vanished without a trace. When it was gone, it felt like I had control over myself again, save for one thing, and that being a strange feeling that I shouldn't tell anyone what happened. So when my mom opened the door and saw me, asking why I looked so pale, all I could say was, it was just a bad dream. You know, the one about the werewolves in the kitchen. Seeming to understand, or at the very least thinking she did, she came over and told me it was all right, and that monsters weren't real. I really wish that was true. I even went to school like normal. I forgot about what happened the night before. School ended, I got home, and I went outside to walk around the neighborhood. I was back home before dinner. I went upstairs to go to bed, having completely forgotten or maybe having wrote it off as a bad dream, and I tried to go to sleep. That night as well, however, it came again, and this time was almost the same as the night before. I lost all of my hearing, and then I could not speak, and finally I was unable to move a muscle. Same as before. And then there was that thing again. This time it had changed positions. Now it was further down the door, its knees bent backwards. It was crossing its arms, which I could tell from its new angle had claws on the end. This thing was now looking right at me, or at least it was pointed in my direction. And once again it stood silent and unmoving. This time I did not even try to do anything. I just looked at it. I waited for it to do something. I waited, and thankfully it did not do anything again, leaving in a similar fashion as the night before. This time, when I left home and got to school, I did not forget about it. The day passed, and I still could not get this thing out of my head. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there. I hadn't seen any horror movies in the last 3 months, and school wasn't stressing me out that bad. So what the reason was to this haunting, or quite possibly stalking, I don't know. I still don't have an answer to it to this day. This happened every night though, and the only things that changed each night were its position towards me and how far away it was. The third night, it had left the door and positioned itself on the floor in between. It was squatting, looking like it was either trying to imitate a frog or prepare to launch itself into the air, towards me, with its claws extended. But it never did. On the fourth night, that primal fear almost went away. However, it got even closer, now peeking its head over the end of my bed, with its hand actually on it. It stayed like that all night. And the next day, I tried to see if it had left some kind of mark on the floor on my bed, but there was nothing. Night 5 came, and it was now crouched on the end of my bed, being careful that it was not touching any part of the bed I occupied with my legs. Night 6, and it was no longer on my bed. but extremely close on the wall to my left, holding a position that looked like it was eyeing a toy or foreign object. Now, before I talk about the last night, as it is the hardest and most uncomfortable part for me to write about, let me say that I had tried to block it from getting closer each day before I went to bed. I would put coats in the closet, which made it leave the door. I tried to put a chair in between me and it from where it was at the night before, and it ended up pushed to the end of my bed. Needless to say, I stopped trying after that, thinking that I was inciting it to get closer each time, and I tried to do something else. That final night, it got close, and by close, I mean it had made sure its face was only a few inches from mine, so there was no way for me to see behind it. It used its arm and a leg on the wall to hold itself up, while the other arm was on the wall behind me, and the other leg was bent and holding onto the right side of my bed. Not only did this thing position itself around me in a way that resembled a spider surrounding a fly in its web, there was also something else that was different. That night, I had control over myself. I could feel that I could move if I wanted to, or make a noise if I tried. I could even hear the TV downstairs still playing and my mom talking to my stepdad. However, even with this revelation, I made no attempt to do anything. As I looked at this thing up close, I could tell that it did actually have a face. However, the mouth, eyes, and what I think was a nose were all located behind its skin. That's also when I noticed that it was smiling with jagged and sharp teeth, at me. I felt that it knew I could move. It almost seemed like it was daring me to try. I didn't take up this bet, and I just waited like I usually did, now with the fresh wave of primal fear I had felt for the first 2 nights. It had no smell, and I half thought that this thing was made for the sole purpose of getting into a house and leaving no trace behind. As it continued to smile and make no movement or noise, I lost track of how many hours had gone by since I went to bed. At some point I realized that, once again, my mom was coming up the stairs to wake me up. But when I noticed this, it did too. Its smile got wider, and it was the only movement this thing had ever made so far. As the sound of footsteps got closer, I saw it disappear and then reappear right before my eyes, going from being point blank on top of me to being right on top of where the door my mom was opening. She opened it, and this time that thing did not leave. It made one final movement, a quick and yet slow motion of its clawed hand to its mouth. It looked like it was telling me, stay quiet, before it left from my sight. After it left, I didn't say a word about it for months, almost a year. I finally told my mother what had happened, and all she said to me was, "Don't worry, nothing in this house will ever hurt you." This should seem like a normal response for a mother to make, but I could have sworn that I saw her go a little pale after I told her. As a result, I wondered for the longest time. I wondered if she meant that there was nothing in the house that could hurt me or want to, or if she meant that even if there was something there, something she knew was there, that it still wouldn't hurt me, even though it very well could. After all of these years, I still don't know what that thing was. I've been told by some that it was just my mind going into overdrive because of stress, but even my mind could never create something as horrific as that. I've told others since then, and some say it was a demon that was just there to feed off of my fear. I have researched what it could be, and the closest things I've found that remotely resemble it would either be a skinwalker or maybe a wendigo. However, those still do not make sense, since those don't have their faces behind their skin. So, to this day, I still wonder what it was, and why it decided to stay around for so long and just do nothing. Was it a demon? Was it a creature from a horror story? Or just a figment of my imagination? One day I hope to find the answer to this, but I have a feeling it won't be for a long time. Call me crazy, but I don't feel like I've seen the last of this thing, and that it may eventually come seeking me out again. Only next time, it won't just stay there and wait for me to do something. Skinwalker in Big Bear. Submitted by Flame Daisy. My husband and I are avid campers. We live in Southern California and go out to the San Bernardino Mountains as often as possible with our 2 dogs. I am from Oregon and grew up in the woods. Did search and rescue religiously, and spent much of my time going on trail rides and hikes as much as possible, just to give you an idea on how much experience I have. We've been married for 2 years and have already been on over 20 camping trips, trying to visit as many different spots as possible, sometimes even switching campsites for a weekend, only spending one night. But this last trip scared the camper out of me, and it may be a while until I'm ready to return to the woods. We stopped by a favorite of ours called Holcomb Valley Campground. We set up camp, played with the dogs, and went for a small walk on the many back roads and some short trails, just revisiting our favorite areas. The dogs were behaving as normal, running around off leash and playing. We were comfortable and calm, and came back to dinner and hot chocolate before it got too cold, and we slipped into the tent for the night. At the time, I was pregnant. I have to go to the bathroom often during the night, and I got up around 2 in the morning. I grabbed a flashlight and brought one of our dogs, a golden retriever, with me. Now, don't let the reputation of the golden retriever fool you about mine. He was raised without much contact with other people except for family, and with our other dog, a pit bull mutt. Moose, our golden, is very alert, doesn't like other people, and growls to warn them off, especially after we became pregnant. He is overprotective of me. Both our dogs are fit, and they're used to camping and going off leash. They don't. Moose's ears pricked up, and he growled his get-away growl. I was nervous. I didn't bring my knife like an idiot, and all I had was a flashlight. I figured it was just someone needing to use the restroom. I ordered Moose to stay by my side, and we left. But no one was there. Moose's hackles were up so high he looked fine, and our pit bull was okay too. Everything was great, and Moose even relaxed a bit, laying down right next to my head, and I eventually fell asleep. Now, here's where it gets really disturbing. I woke up about 45 minutes later to a low woof from Moose and our pit bull growling. They were listening intently to my side of the tent, both of them nearly shaking. I put a hand on them to calm them down, and that only made them jump and growl even more. My husband is such a heavy sleeper, I knew I couldn't wake him. So I got a knife ready, and I listened. I would say whatever it was about 40 to 50 feet away from us. It was stalking over the fence that divided the campsite from the road. It sounded deer-like, with light feet just barely crunching over the ground. I had been camping with herds of deer before, and it sounded very much like that, and our dogs had never seen a deer before, so I gave it to them that they might be scared. I lay back down and just quieted them, saying very clearly, "It's okay, guys, it's just a deer." But then, the deer outside said something, in almost my same voice. Just a deer. This voice said it like it was practicing something. Like how you rehearse a line you just can't get right in a speech. I gasped so hard my dog started barking like crazy. My husband jumped up and hollered at them for scaring him. I listened for the thing again, almost in tears. But the sound never came. The dogs were on edge for what seemed like hours until they finally calmed down, and it wasn't until then that I could finally fall asleep. When I woke up the next time, it was from a bad dream. I just remember running barefoot, and my feet were cold from being outside of the sleeping bag. It was nearly 5 in the morning, and the dogs were on edge again. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my knife and sat up listening to everything. I said clearly, "Are you there?" towards the direction of the fence, but nothing said anything. I think I repeated myself about 2 more times until a coyote howled. It was far away and clear, and I was starting to calm down, thinking I was silly for thinking that something like a skinwalker was out there, when the coyote howled again, this time much, much closer to us, like right across the road. And this one was not a coyote. It was a high-pitched yip that would end in a hoarse growl. It did it again and again, rehearsing the howl over and over. My husband woke up to this, asking me if it was a coyote. Petrified, I told him I didn't think so. This thing howled for over 10 minutes until it stopped and finally left. My dogs were just as scared as I was. That morning, we went for another walk, then packed our things to move to the next campsite. Our moose ended up vomiting most of the day, and that made me panic. He was on edge, so he couldn't keep anything down, and our pit bull was listening to anything and everything, never leaving our sides for a moment. That night, we were at a completely different campsite on the other side. So luckily, nothing happened, and the dogs were able to get some sleep. But the next day, we stopped in Big Bear for lunch. Moose was all better at that time, and we all went for a walk in the village when we ran into our neighbors we recognized at Holcomb Valley Campground. We asked them about the coyote, and they suddenly went pale. They told us about what happened that night. We'll call the woman Mary and the man Ben. They had a small dog named Benji. So they said Benji had to go out in the middle of the night, so they unzipped the tent and let him do his business. He just ran to the fence and was barking until Ben went out and got him. Ben said that across the road, he saw a man standing there, and when he waved his hand, the man ran away into the woods. All night, Benji and the other dogs were barking like crazy until a few hunters went to investigate. They had their bows and a couple of knives, a few trained hunting dogs too. They crossed the road and went after the man to see if he needed help. They got about 20 feet into the woods when this man screamed at them with something between a coyote and something from a scary movie. It woke everyone up, and one guy claimed that the thing shifted before them into something like a deer with impossibly thin legs, and it bounded away faster than any animal he had ever seen. My husband doesn't believe in this kind of stuff. He shrugged it off as people being tired and the night being so dark. But I know that it was a skinwalker, and that's more than enough to keep me away and to keep me up at night. So for people who love to camp up in Big Bear, be careful when you venture up into the hills. There's something up there. Whatever it was, it followed me. Submitted by Noto Bird. It was a summer just a few years ago. I slept in a bunk bed with my brothers in the room that we shared. I woke up one night from the top bunk. Like I said, it was summer, and it tends to get stuffy at night, so the window was open. I could hear a very slow, raspy breathing and the sound of the screen from the window being scratched. I quietly rolled over onto my stomach and looked over to the side of the bed down at the window. It looked like a man, but its features were just wrong. It was as pale as the moon and bone thin. It had long arms, and it had a hand with long fingers scratching at the screen of the window. Its eyes gave off a soft glow, and they sort of lit up the room a little bit. It was just looking around the room from behind the window. It wasn't even trying to get in. It was just examining the room. From what I could tell, it hadn't spotted me yet, and I couldn't get out of bed without it seeing me. So I just crawled to the other side of the bed, the side by the door, and I lay silently, terrified until morning. It left after about an hour, judging by the digital clock on top of the TV. The next morning, I went outside and studied the window. Whatever had been there had to have been at least 7 feet tall, because the window was about 5 feet off the ground and this thing was hunched over. A few weeks go by, and I go on a camping trip. My brothers were in Boy Scouts, and I was allowed to go on the camping trips with them, which I loved because I've always loved the forest. It was in this enormous forest in the middle of nowhere. The property belongs to someone from Scouts, and there's nobody else for miles. Everything goes fine. It was a fun day of fishing and hiking and s'mores. Everyone's about to get in their tents for the night. Then everyone is silenced by an echoing, blood-curdling scream. It was definitely, absolutely not a fox, and there haven't been any mountain lions in the entire state for centuries, so it couldn't have been one of those either. Somehow, and I don't know how, everyone was able to get some sleep after that. I convinced myself to get into the big family tent, and soon, feeling safe and warm, I'm out cold. I woke up to the sound of the tent fabric being scratched at. I look around, and on one of the nylon walls, long scratches are being made periodically from the outside. I turn on the lantern hanging from the ceiling, and it stops. I can see its silhouette. It's the same thing from only weeks before. Large, tall, bone-thin with long arms and legs. It creeps away. It begins to do the same thing to the other tents around the campsite. I wait for it to finally leave, and I turn off the lantern, staring and in shock. I was somehow able to fall asleep. My dad's really into paranormal stuff, but I honestly don't know how he'd take all this. I haven't told it much, and every person who cared to listen just didn't take it seriously. I haven't seen it since, thank God, but whatever it was had followed me from my house in the suburbs to the forest out of town. I've always slept on the other side of the bed since then, away from my window. After doing some research, I think this mostly matches the creatures known as skinwalkers or maybe a wendigo. Thing in the Forest. Submitted by Cole. Okay, so for privacy reasons, I will not be using my real name. In the story, my name is Cole. I was in middle school and 14 when this happened. In California, we tend to go out hunting, or if you can't, then you play hide and seek and other games like manhunt and stuff. My friends and I were playing hide and seek. Their names are Zach, Jordan, Amelia, and Joe. Zach was it. We all charged away from our houses and into the woods. Joe and I hid in trees and not far apart, maybe a few trees away. It was getting dark when we started, so it was probably 9:45. Also, the seeker had a flashlight. Joe and I were waiting to get caught and were whispering to each other when out of nowhere, heavy crunching of leaves came from the left. There was no light and we thought it might be Jordan, but we didn't call his name in case it was an animal. The crunching was about 20 feet away, then it stopped. I heard a very quiet scraping noise, then the scraping started again, even closer, like it had come 10 feet closer in 5 seconds without making any noise at all. Joe and I heard a tree branch snap and looked where it might have come from. This thing was in a tree in the middle between me and Joe. It was very long and had some hair on its arms and legs, and no hair anywhere else, and had sharp, stubby-like claws for climbing. It had ripped up the branch it was on. This thing was looking at me now. I was scared out of my mind. It made a roar or a hiss, and in a fraction of a second, it was on the second tree closer to me. I jumped down and screamed with all my might. "Get away! Joe, run!" The creature was now in the tree that I was in merely seconds before. Joe heard me and jumped out of his tree, and we ran so fast that we were in my house in a snap. We heard loud, ripping noises coming from the woods. We took my dad's flashlight that can light up a distance of 50 feet and shined it at the tree. The tree was torn apart. Then we heard insanely deafening steps. We shined it in the forest again, and it was making its way toward us. It was over 9 feet tall, with black eyes and huge hands. We flew inside, locked all the windows and doors, and called our parents and the police. Jordan, Amelia, and Zach ran inside when they heard us screaming. I don't know what I saw that cold day, and I'm glad I made it out alive at all. Something was at the door. Submitted by Nathaniel Olive. My name is Nathaniel, but most of my family members called me Nate or Nathan. And by the time these events had happened, I had fully moved out of my aunt's acreage and had been living in my creepy house for about 5 years. I had turned 11, and I had come to visit my aunt and uncle for a family get-together to say hi and hang out with my cousins. I will give a little background information about the house. It was built by my aunt and uncle before I was born, and it lay on a hill with part of the basement not inside of the ground because the hill is sloped. The part of the house that is not in the dirt faces the woods and has 3 windows on the left side of the living room and a large door that is on the left of the room that is right next to the last window toward the left of the living room. There is a large door that is on the left of the room that is right next to the last window of the left of the living room. There is also an inlet area to the very far right that has a counter or bar looking area. This is buried under the hill, so it doesn't have any windows. The living room is connected to the stairs that are in the hallway, and the hallway has a bathroom at the end of it. There are 2 spare rooms and a toy room on the right side. The toy room also leads into a room that connects to the outside through a little door and window. This room isn't usually locked because the door that leads to the toy room is locked 100% of the time. This door that connects to the toy room is made of wood and has a pane of misted, translucent glass. We ate dinner, and my mom and aunt decided to get drunk, so we were going to have to stay the night. My brother and I had to sleep in the basement, and I was fine with it because I had stayed there many times before. My brother and I were forced to stay in the same room downstairs by the living room, which faced the woods directly across from the house. The windows facing the forest are split up, and there are 3 of them on the left side of the room. They are 5 feet by 3 feet windows and are very large. The room also has a door on the right side of the room, just next to the last window on the left. This door doesn't have a lock on it, it's just a doorknob. It's not like I haven't seen wolves, coyotes, bears, and mountain lions, and since I am an avid hunter, I'm quite sure the thing I saw that night was not any of them. During the night, around 3 in the morning, I had gotten up to get a drink, and while I was in the washroom, I heard a tapping sound from the living room, and then I heard my name called. "Nathaniel, come here." The voice called in my mom's voice, and I found this weird because she usually calls me Nathan, but she was intoxicated, so I didn't feel too concerned. Thinking she was drunk and was sleeping on the downstairs living room couch, I peered around the corner of the hallway to look into the living room. This, however, was a mistake because what I saw was a large figure standing about 5 feet from the window. The only features it had that I could see were its arms that were very long and had a full set of creepy, spindly fingers. Its torso was very thick at the top, but turned into a V shape as it went down towards the waist. I could not see the head because it was so tall the head was out of view. As I watched it, it began to move towards the door that leads into the living room, and with a long thin arm it reached for the handle. Seeing this happen seriously disturbed me, and I knew I needed to scream. So that is what I did. I screamed so loud that I woke up everyone in the house, including my very drunk aunt and mother. Before I knew what was happening, the thing at the door bolted into the woods, and these woods are about 50 feet from the door. And it made that run in about 1.5 seconds flat. As I watched it running before it went into the woods, it went down onto all 4s and disappeared into the pitch black darkness of the forest. About 10 seconds after this, my uncle came down the stairs with his loaded shotgun that he kept in the house. He saw me on the floor just outside the living room, almost pissing myself. He knew I had seen something and asked what it was. I told him, but he just shrugged it off because he thought I had seen a wolf or coyote outside the door. The worst part was, when I went up to the door and looked at the knob, I realized it hadn't been locked. I'm 18 now, and I have not stayed at this house until recently, about 2 months ago. This time, I stayed the night because my uncle and I were going out the next day on a week-long camping trip to go hunting and fishing. I again had to stay in that basement in the guest room next to the living room. I didn't really feel unsafe that night until I was awakened by a noise in the toy room across from my room. A tapping noise, and then a voice that sounded like my uncle's, but strangely weird.
"Nathaniel, come here and give me a hand."
By this time, I was seriously freaked out, and I looked outside my room into the toy room. Inside that room, I could see the door that connects to the next room, and through the glass, I could see the figure. The same figure I had seen so many years ago, standing there and tapping on the pane of the glass. I went up to the hallway connecting door and slammed it shut.
There was no end
and
to
collapsed
its head.
against it, beginning
It
to
just kept
cry.
going.
My aunt and uncle
I
heard the
couldn't
door
see a
slam and
skull
ran
or
downstairs
hairline.
to see me
I couldn't
crying.
see horns.
They asked what
And the
happened,
creature
and
was
they asked me a very
standing outside the
creepy
hall,
question.
leaning inside my parents' room.
Did you
If
see
I could
the
see
thing?
its eyes, then surely I must have been able to
Thing
see the
that's
top
been
of its
bothering
head,
us
right?
for years?
But no.
I looked up at them,
Even as a
and I
kid,
could see
I
the
remember
fear in their
staring
eyes.
dumbstruck at it.
I nodded,
and my only
and they
thought
sat
was,
next to me and gave me
where's
a
the
hug.
ending to its head? It
The
just
next
kept
morning,
going.
my uncle and I headed
Then,
out,
after
and
those
we
few
went on our
seconds
trip.
where we were just staring
Before
at each other,
going, we
the
looked in the
TV
room I saw the
exploded.
figure in that night.
There is a lining
And on the
between
other side of the
TV
pane of
and the
glass,
back,
there was a
which
chip that
technicians
wasn't
can
there the
remove
day
to get to
before.
the circuits.
Apparently,
And I heard a
after I
zapping
had
kind
seen
of
this
sound,
thing
blue
7 years
sparks
earlier,
exploded out
it
the
had
back of
begun
the
to
TV,
torment my
and the
cousins
picture shut
by
off.
tapping on
I
their
jumped
windows
and turned my
and
head
calling
to
in their
look
mom
when
and
the
dad.
TV exploded, and in that second, the creature slammed the door, the hardest slam I have ever heard till now, and I was alone. After a moment, I recovered a bit and yelled, "Hey!" and ran to the door to chase after the monster. But when I opened my parents' door, the hallway was totally deserted. I ran downstairs yelling, "Dad!" thinking he had something to do with this. When I got downstairs, my sister was in the living room, and I asked her where Dad was. She said, "He's not home yet. You know it's too early." And sure enough, there was no car in the driveway. I asked my sister if she heard a loud door slam, and she said no. I went back upstairs to look, but it wasn't anywhere in the house. I was almost ready to believe. I imagined the whole thing, but when I tried to turn the TV on again, it wouldn't work. My parents assumed a bulb must have busted and got a bigger TV. I never dared to mention why the TV suddenly broke. So that's my story. Ever since, I've been just waiting to see another demon. But not even on the internet can I find something that correlates very much. I don't know if its skin was pure black or if it was just blocking out the light, or if it caused that level of pitch darkness. But all I could see were those eyes. I'm a 32-year-old man, yet it is broad daylight as I write this post because what I'm about to share haunts me to this day. To the point that merely thinking about this memory is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only told this story to a handful of people over the past 10 years because of how terrifying of an experience it was for me. But I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share with others. Maybe others have had a similar experience. To tell this story and give it justice, I have to tell of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter this post is about. My name is Joshua, but I will change names to protect the privacy of others involved in this story. I live in Arkansas, and in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf with my friend, we'll call him Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980-something white Celebrity. It was really a piece of crap vehicle. Anywho, it was becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car, and he took us around the area. First to an old abandoned house, but other than some raccoons rustling around, it was a 2-hour waste of time. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted, but again a bust. Then an old church that was run down and supposed to be haunted, once again, yawn. At this point, it was getting close to midnight, and my wife and I were getting pretty bored, and I spoke up to Bob saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." Then that's when Bob smiled, saying he was saving the best for last. He handed me a Polaroid picture of a hillside covered in trees in daylight. I asked him what it was. He asked me if I saw the house or any type of lighting pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied no. He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there is no power lines either. During this time, he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. Then after that, it was 2 miles of dirt road, with woods on one side and a barbed wire fence on the other, with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night, except the moon above our heads, and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us all to get out. We did what he asked. He walked us to the other side of the car where the wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone, which had no signal. This was 2003 and the area had no cell towers. But he looked at his phone and said it was 11:57 p.m. and told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even at night, I could tell it was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing has changed. Then at exactly midnight, a small light flickers on. A deep chill runs down my back as we all watch this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, swaying back and forth. We sat and watched it in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes. When I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this, Bob said he did not know, but the locals told him that every night at 12 a.m., This lantern will light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything could scare or hurt me. So since there was no houses around, I yelled out, "We see you! Wow, you're so scary with your little lantern." Bob shushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but I stopped as I looked to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth, but moving down the hillside to the field at a frightening pace. It began to speed across the field towards our car. We didn't stick around to see what it was because within seconds, we were in the car flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back to see the lantern moving slowly back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent until Bob spoke up saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed. And if we decide to go back out anywhere, it'd be best to take my truck until we could get gas in the morning, as he only had about a half a quarter tank." I said okay. A few minutes later, we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and talked about what just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time and told him she was getting hungry. He told her we brought some snacks, but she said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if he could take my truck to the next town over to get some food, because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get to that town. I agreed. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key, and nothing happened. My truck was dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise, nothing. This was strange and made us all feel uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood, pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jump my truck with his car. This is where it gets even stranger. As soon as we connected the jumper cables to his battery, the cables between the connectors started to smoke, and in a flash of fire, they burnt up within seconds. The cables were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the clamps at the end still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car, and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other. That was getting louder. It was a boat motor. Now, like I said, it was the time of year when it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up, standing still, waiting. But somebody was on a boat after midnight, when it had to be ice cold with the wind hitting them. And from the sound of the motor, it was going pretty fast, but we saw nothing. That was until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the woman to get in his car and lock the doors. I reach the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another. I work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of trade in my truck. We were standing in the middle of our vehicles, with the hoods up, as the boat pulls forward to the dock. Two heavily bearded men in their late 30s step out of the boat and walk up. It is hard to give an accurate description as their spotlight was still pointed at us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow while blinding Bob and I. They look at us and at our vehicles, and one glanced in the direction of the car at the women, then back at us and let out a small chuckle. "You fellers got in some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. Yeah, but nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet and sees the smoking ashes of what was our jumper cable. "Looks like it was more than your weak jumper cables could handle. You all need some help? We got some tools on our boat that I think can fix you guys' problem right up." Then the other man who chuckled says, "Fix 'em right up." I'm speechless at this moment, probably with my mouth hanging open. I can't remember as the two men walk back to their boat and hear what sounded like chains rattling around. But the spotlight is so blinding we can barely see, but the chain noise was enough. Bob looked at me without saying a word. We both jumped in his car and drove the hell out of there. For the next few hours, we drove to a populated area of houses, which wasn't many in the secluded area. We were pretty much stuck, since we had very little fuel, but we all sat quiet in the car, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking that any time those men would find us. Bob turned his lights on every now and then, thinking that he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while, the women fell asleep, and Bob and I talked about how weird this whole ordeal had been. He laughs, saying, "I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know it would be this sort of scary." At this point, the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out. But the men never showed up, and eventually the morning was on its way. And it was about 20 minutes until sunrise. Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas, and he said, "Yeah, the local store opens up in an hour, so we'll be fine." I tell him in that case, then sure. We wake up the women and drive back to the hillside. We get there about 4 minutes left until sunrise, and we still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me and I smile and do the motion for zipping my lips, and we all watch in wonder as right at sunrise the lantern slowly fades away to nothing. After this, we get back in our car and drive to the lake, feeling safer now. When we got there, there was no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck was still up, and the doors were still locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try to start the truck one more time, before he drives us somewhere where I can't get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up, with no hesitation or problem. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings, and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating to others, and that we never wanted to come back to the area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I hadn't seen in almost 2 years at this point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me that he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places, and asked me if I would be willing to film their session in a haunted place for their records, and that they would pay me well for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I've always loved the paranormal, even after what I went through at Sugarloaf. I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown. I told him yes, I would love to film for them, but I had no interest in joining in. I was okay with watching and just getting to be out there looking into the paranormal again. So, of course my next question was when and where we're going to be doing this first. When he answered me, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wished so much that I had trusted my gut feeling and told him I changed my mind. Remember the lantern light near Sugarloaf? He asked me if there was any way I could ever forget. Yeah, I stammered. Why do you ask? Bob said. I told my group the story, and they want to do the ritual there, and see if they can contact the spirit to find out why it's there, and what it wants. I don't know, man. Oh, come on, Josh, trust me, you'll be safe, and I'm gonna pay you $250 just to sit there and film it, he retorted. At the time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight, because diapers, formula, and the cost of a small fortune. Not to mention it was our first kid, so my wife had been going crazy spending money on just the necessities. I had to weigh out my fear of the area. I accepted Bob's offer, and a week later, I was in the same beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years before. This time, Bob and 3 others, that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces. It was 11:50 p.m. when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was behind them, to the right about 5 feet from the barbed wire fence, which was in front of the field that led to the hillside. My back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence, and I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. As As I've been typing this entire post, I have been getting knots in my stomach, knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part of the story haunts my dreams and even waking hours to this day. I'm going to do my best to describe how the following events unfolded. I know mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued, or how horribly horrific the events sounded and were. So when reading or listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up. And believe me when I say, up until this point in my life, I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out and go ghost hunting and getting myself spooked or whatever. But after this night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I show it respect and stay as far away as possible. As much as I dread it, I will now finish telling the story. And his group is chanting. Bob lights up a huge candle in the middle of them and opens some sort of book. Not like a scary antique spell book or anything. It looks like a newer hardcover. Anyways, he starts reciting words from it and then looks at his phone. He tells his group to be quiet and look at the hill. I turn the camera at midnight, on the dot, and the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool!" I rolled my eyes. Since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word cool didn't seem to fit in their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempted to communicate with the spirit. I turned my head back to the light and began to film the group as they chanted again. Bob reads from the book, then they start asking questions, in hopes the spirit would respond. About this time, a wind picks up and Bob's candle goes out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute. And I agree and stop recording and watch as Bob tries his lighter, then 2 lighters from the group. But none of the lighters are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing a rustling behind me. I jumped up, leaving the camera on the ground, and spun around. Bob and his group were preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I turned around, I was blinded by the brightest light I have ever seen. What I believe was the lantern, up close and personal, but as quickly as it appears, the light was gone. The lantern is nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field right behind me without me realizing it, within a span of maybe 30 seconds. I look around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It's only 12:15 a.m. and the light always stayed until sunrise. At this moment, the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick, and see it light up. I mutter, guys, did you see that?" They all turn and ask what I was talking about. But before I can answer them, we were all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from seemingly nowhere. And this is no ordinary laughter. It sounds like the laughter of hundreds, maybe even thousands of children. That haunts me to this very moment. As I type this, I am looking around the room I am in. Whenever I talk or think about this experience, I can vividly remember the sound and hear it in my head. The best way I can describe the laughter for you, imagine listening to a large group of kids singing "Row Your Boat." You know how one kid will start, and seconds later, another will join in, starting at the beginning of the song, and so on? Well, it sounded like that. I said like hundreds or thousands of children laughing. As if one started laughing, seconds later another would. The pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row Your Boat." I'm saying they laughed in unison, like kids do when singing "Row Your Boat." One would start, then seconds later another, then another, and the laughter was getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing all around us, coming from all directions. I was shaking, I could not move. I was spinning around, looking off in the distance. This couldn't be real, this sort of thing doesn't happen. What the hell is happening? I scream at Bob and his group, "We need to get the hell out of here." But they are already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candle behind. Without hesitation, I run after them and jump in the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We peeled out of there and drove about a mile up the road and pull over as Bob is in no condition to drive. We were all freaking out. We all got out, pacing around the car, asking each other if we really just heard all that. I tell Bob that I'm sorry, but I left his camera behind. He says he does not care, and that he isn't going back for it. At this point, I got my hands on my knees panting, trying to catch my breath, as I've never been that terrified in my life. That is when all the chatter stops, and once again, we hear the laughter off in the distance, very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder, until once again it's becoming deafening. We jumped back in the car and sped away. We drove for about 6 miles, and for the first 3 miles we could still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little bit. We all began to calm down a little by mile 4, when the laughter could no longer be heard. But we have no intention of pulling over again. Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone, waiting for the signal to pop up. And at about mile 6, Bob's friend, he finally has a signal. And he hands the phone to Bob, and he calls a friend of his, who is into the supernatural and well-versed and educated in it. As we were driving, he is describing what happened to the lady. Bob later told me that his friend told him she believed it was children of the Hecate, or something like that. I have no idea what Hecate is, but it sounded like more of a guess to me. Anyway, Bob is on the phone, speeding out of the area. Me and the 2 other people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time. They later told me that the hair on the back of their neck stood up as a loud snapping noise comes from under the front end of the car, and Bob's celebrity stops dead in its tracks, and will no longer move forward. He tries everything, but the car is not moving. We later discovered that the tie rod had snapped. Anyways, the friend Bob was talking to on the phone only lived 20 minutes away from where we were, and said that they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke. After about 3 minutes, we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road toward us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but Bob and I thought maybe we could get a ride from a local. We all unloaded out of the car and stood in front, waiting for the vehicle to hopefully stop. Now I cannot be certain, but my gut tells me I'm correct. The vehicle doesn't stop, but it does come into view. It is an old beat-up truck, and it slows down, and in the truck are 2 men in their late 30s with huge beards. They stare at us and sped up after passing by. I look at Bob, and before I could speak, he says what I was already thinking. The guys from the boat. Before I can say anything back, we see the headlights coming from the same direction the truck went. We stood up and stayed quiet, as the same guys in the truck passed by slowly, again staring at us. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get here now. 4 or 5 minutes go by, and we see the headlights coming. Relieved, we all get our stuff, ready thinking it's Bob's friend. Then the phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and was going to be about 10 to 15 minutes more before she gets there. Bob hangs up the phone, and we watch in terror as the same truck slowly passes by again. This time, only one of the boatmen in the truck. The driver slows down to a crawl and says, "Looks like you fellers could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact to Bob and I that we were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell did the other guy go? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse, at this point we had almost forgotten completely about due to the boatmen. We began to hear laughter again off in the distance, but all around us, like before. Over the next few minutes, it started getting closer and closer. I am almost pissing my pants as the sound is deafening and we have nowhere to run this time. And then from behind the car, off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights turn on and 2 vehicles coming toward us slowly, side by side. taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road. The laughter now seemed to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road we were stuck on, and the laughing seemed to be zeroing in on us, as if hundreds or thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There is no wind, no sound other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky road, and the two vehicles slowly driving toward us. With our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children, and the headlights of the two vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we are given a reprieve, as at this time, coming from the other direction, we see another set of headlights coming fast. We hold our breath, the laughter, the boatmen. What could be next? How will we get out of this? And then the vehicle that was speeding at us pulls up, and it's Bob's friend. She unlocks the doors on her car and rolls her window down and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the two sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kids." She screams at us to get in, and we do. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around, and no sooner than she starts to drive away, the two sets of headlights come on again with their brights on, and they are only about a car length behind us. I yell at the driver, "Go, go, go!" channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her, "Faster, we must go faster." She floors it, and for about 2 miles, the two vehicles stay on our trail. Then they turn off onto a side road. The next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter off in the distance with our windows down. Then 3 miles after that, the laughter was gone. To this day, I have no explanation on what happened, what the laughing children were, why the laughing followed us, if the boatmen were connected to this all somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence that happened to terrify us at the same time. And if that's the case, why did they not react to the laughing children sound? Is the lantern connected to the laughing children? Or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children with their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it. I have had constant chills and goosebumps while writing this. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You can think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how powerful or mundane the paranormal could be. If you use paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly sociopathic hillbillies and laughing children. I hope everyone who reads this or listens to it sleeps well, but I know after telling my story, the next few nights I will be getting no sleep at all. So, to give background, at the time of this story, I was a freshman at a small Christian college in Massachusetts when this happened on a Saturday night in the spring. On this particular Saturday, I had decided not to go out to any parties because I wasn't feeling it. So instead, I decided to hang out with a few friends and drive around and do random things. At around 12:30 a.m., some friends were getting tired and wanted to go hit the hay. So we drove them up to their dorms and dropped them off. So the only two people left were myself and a friend of mine. Before I left to go into my dorm, she said she wanted to talk to me about her liking one of my close friends, so I stayed and talked for a while. It was around 1:15 a.m. where things started to get weird. I was looking at her talking when out of my peripheral vision saw something white and small fly across the windshield, and my head snapped. Her seeing me asked what I saw, so I explained it being a white bird, to which her response was, there's no white birds here. That was when the feeling hit me. Have you ever felt so strongly about something internally, like pure joy or extreme sadness? I felt that feeling, except nothing besides pure fear. I couldn't tell you what it was from, but but I sat in the passenger seat frozen with fear from something I didn't know. The girl, we will call her Becca, instantly knew something was wrong because she asked me, Connor, are you okay? To which I replied, yeah, I'm fine, to try not to freak her out. She replied with, "Stop bullshitting, your eyes are huge and you're sitting up and pale as you could be." She had me there. I looked at my arms and my hair was standing straight on end. I tried to explain what I was feeling to no avail. Then it got worse. I literally couldn't move in my seat and started seeing shadows move, but nobody was walking around. Keep in mind, it was 2 a.m. Becca saw my eyes dart from side to side and kept asking me what I saw, to which I reply, "Nothing." Then, around 2:30, the thing that spooked me out the most arrived. I was being a nervous wreck when my eyes caught something down a hill near the dumpsters. It had arms and legs, but it was way too tall to be a person. Plus, there was no visible feet, and it was a solid 2 feet off the ground and all black. As I stared at this thing, it moved from where I saw it to across the dumpsters and then left my sight. And the reason it left my sight, it wasn't because it was behind the building out of viewpoint. No, it just vanished. Just like that. Gone. By this time, I was struggling to even take a consistent breath from the amount of terror I was feeling. Becca was trying to calm me down. Give her credit, but while I was looking at her talking to me, I kept noticing her eyes darting around to random places behind me. Every time I asked what she saw, she said nothing. Eventually, I was able to get my ass out of the car and sprint to my dorm room, but that was not until 5 a.m. I eventually fell asleep and woke up trying to convince myself it was all just because I was overtired and that I was seeing things and overreacting. Becca texted me that morning to ask if everything was okay. What she said confirmed all my fears. Now that it was daytime, she finally confessed what she saw when she was trying to calm me down. A few shadows were there, and a weird sort of evil feeling was in the air, and a weird floating thing off in the distance. "Wait a minute," I said. "Shadows and feelings I can deal with, but explain that floating thing you saw." She described the same exact floating thing that I saw near the dumpsters to every detail. And when she saw it after I did, it was about 20 feet from the car behind me. This had me terrified. I couldn't walk near those dumpsters for weeks, let alone walk up the hill at night. Luckily, I never saw or felt these things again. I will never know who or what really was there, but I do know I am confident that it was the devil himself trying to confront me and make me question my faith. Before then, I never really believed in ghosts or entities, but now I absolutely do. And Becca confirms it all. Whatever you were. A few years back, my girlfriend and I, having hiked several other parts of the Appalachian Trail, decided we wanted to give the southern portion of Virginia's trail a shot. It's about 166 miles long and runs through George Washington and Jefferson National Forests. This is definitely one of those more remote and less traveled parts of the trail, which is exactly what we were looking for. We gathered our gear and made our way up to the start of the Virginia Creeper Trail to begin our journey. We had planned our journey to end at Damascus, and figured by the time that we got there, we would be more than ready to get home to our own beds. It was early October, and the changing of the leaves and the colors were amazing. The air was crisp and cool, perfect hiking weather with beautiful scenery. The majority of the trip was pretty uneventful, just your typical hike, but our last couple of nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the hike, you were supposed to camp on the trail, or a designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people, and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore the suggestions and find our own little spot off the trail. A bit of searching and we found a little spot off the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked for a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I was awoken by my girlfriend, shaking me, telling me someone is outside walking around our tent. She informed me that she woke up with what sounded like someone right outside the tent, running a stick or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a judge with me. You never know exactly who or what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the judge out of my bag, and then sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it. Someone or something was walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black, illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon. I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away as to not give away that I was out of the tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. It sounded like it was something on two legs by the way its steps were placed. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my arms drawn and slowly approached towards the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then from my right, I hear a sound of someone running through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot, hear who or whatever was there take off into the woods. There's no way I'm giving chase, so I return to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent in the darkness until daybreak. In the morning, I look around for a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some of the soft moist dirt not too far from our tent. It wasn't mine and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked me out as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was sulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point, we were already pretty deep in and still had 2 days left. That day, we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place the tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling that we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this, as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to the tent. I gave my girl the 1911 and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if I slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like someone going through our stuff outside our tent. I grabbed my gun and woke my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out something along the lines of, "We are armed, get out of here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, ready to go crazy on someone. Our stuff was scattered everywhere. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled. There was a creek nearby and I walked to the edge, where there was a small trail running alongside it. Down the creek, I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could and that we were leaving now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items and headed back on the trail in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some time. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere and quite literally on our own. Since we hadn't seen any other hiker the entire time we had been out there, I really felt that we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw someone step onto the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me they were still following us for a while. We eventually reached the end of the trail and got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was someone just messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of hillbillies. I will never know because I will not be returning to find out. At the time, I was 10 years old and lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland. Almost every house had acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As I now am 21 and live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while, but it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself as my mother went to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child and my father worked in another province months at a time, so I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forest. This night, I was exploring said woods. I never went too far, usually up to a large rock formation. I like to climb and look through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened being out there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying. Faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared since crying was the last thing I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined that there was a young girl that somehow wandered off too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help out, but then I worried that the girl would wander further and I wouldn't be able to hear her anymore. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction the crying was in. It definitely wasn't easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to make sure that I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all this was how consistent the crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind, just non-stop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was that the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I had eventually reached a small clearing that had only a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far before, and this was the first time I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder was peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had went all this way expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady footsteps advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I had identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back and I didn't try to listen to see if the person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran into my house, locking the door and shutting all the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I really would be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked through them as discreetly as I could, to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but stayed at the window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest's shadows, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I also never was able to go back into that forest again. Despite a few creepy instances as a child, there's only been one time in my adult life that I truly felt primal fear. My apology if it's a little long, but trust I am being as concise as possible, and need to explain the surroundings a little at first. I live in a village in the middle of the English countryside. To paint an accurate picture of its size, it has a population of 4,000, but it feels more like 1,000 due to its spread out nature, and being surrounded on all sides by lots of fields. Farms and woods eventually connect to one pretty famous forest. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and because of this, it has notoriously bad phone and internet connections. Having lived here all my life, I know this place like the back of my hand. I know where all the public footpaths through the woods are, where they connect, which are shortcuts, where to cross deep streams, etc. I have gone on walks in this area throughout my childhood with my parents and alone as an adult. I felt safe here. This story takes place last summer in July after I moved home from university. As usual, this day both my parents got home at 5 p.m. We had dinner for a while longer than usual as my mom had quite a hectic day and was telling me about it. Because of this, I ended up heading out for my walk an hour later than routine, around 7 p.m. But as it was summer, the sun was still shining, so honestly, I didn't really notice that it would start getting dark until I was out. The woodland closest to my house is less than 5 minutes away, and you enter through a gate into a farmer's field. You can see across the open area quite far until the first set of small woods obscures your view. That's where I was heading, as I knew this track takes under 2 hours and leads back to the same path I was standing on now. This entire area is very popular for dog walkers, so it's not unusual to see other people while you're out and about. And as this village, everybody says hello to everybody. I start walking. I'm just in my own world for a while until less than 100 feet before the entrance of the woods. An elderly man was coming out of them throwing a ball for his collie dog. As I got closer, I recognized it was John, who lived on the road next to mine and knew my grandpa. We stopped and I said hello as I patted his dog Max. While talking, I see another man coming out of the woods. No dog. Bright green jacket, very tall, and a good 10 years on me, age-wise. John and I chatter another minute and say goodbye. He warns me not to stay out there too long as it will be getting dark soon. True, the sky was bright pink and orange. The sun was indeed beginning to set. I hadn't really noticed. I continued down the path towards the man. When we were nearly passing each other, I look up to make brief eye contact, smile and say hello, like everyone here does, even if you don't recognize the person. My eyes instantly met his. He was already looking at me. His dark eyes locked on mine. He wasn't smiling. I didn't know him at all, but I knew something was wrong. It was in his eyes. I swallowed my politeness and looked to the ground as we passed. I had lived in my uni city the past couple years, so I knew a red flag when I saw one, and my country bumpkin manners evaporated. I quickened my pace a little before entering the woods and shyly looked back. The guy was still walking in the same direction, following John. I felt relieved, starting to walk into the woods. It takes about 30 minutes to follow the path through the woods to the end. The pathway exit opened into another field that led to another set of woods. The sky was now a dark purple, the dimming light having been obscured to me by the trees. I was near the entrance of the second set of woods when I felt it. Fear, complete crippling and absolute fear, worked its way like electricity through me. I never felt anything like it before, or since, but I knew what it was. I whipped around. Standing at the exit of the first set of woods was the man. I could still make out his green jacket in the fading light. He's doubled back, and very quickly too. I had looked back several times while in those trees, and he hadn't been there. For a second I froze, as he did. He knew I'd seen him. To sprint the distance between us, it would take him about 5 minutes. He was obviously in good shape. I bolted into the woods. There was only one way I could go. I didn't care to look behind me. I sprinted for a couple of minutes before taking a sharp left turn off the path into the trees, hoping to throw him off a bit, but I couldn't see a thing. The light was already darkening and the trees made it 100 times worse, especially as I was now in the thick of them. Their branches catching my clothes like fingers, whipping and scratching my bare legs so badly. I ran and my lungs protested in pain, while my heart was beating like mad. I couldn't anymore. I got myself on the ground behind a big tree, my back against it, knees to my chest, hand over my mouth to stifle my breathing, desperately trying to pump air into my lungs for the next sprint. I listened for the first time. A few seconds pass silently. Then I hear him. Heavy footsteps snapping twigs behind me about 20 feet to my left. I dare not to look in case he sees me. I have my phone, but I know I have little chance of signal being where I was, and he'd either hear me talking or see the light from the display. I'm not ashamed to say at this point I started to cry, the tears falling silently down my cheeks.
"What the hell?"
I hear a deep voice exclaim.
"Where are you? I know you're here. I saw you."
I have to clasp both my hands across my mouth to stop myself from making any noise. I can hear him moving around. I panic and find that I have the courage to slowly peek from behind the tree. He was about 10 feet behind me, less than 20 feet to my left, with his back to me. I moved back and my eyes searched the surrounding area. I pick up a pretty heavy rock. I carefully check him again. His back's still turned, but he's searching through the trees. Hunched down lower to the ground now. I make a snap decision, and with everything I had left in me, I threw the rock behind me to the right. It clattered through the branches of the trees and made one hell of a noise. I watched him immediately bolt in its direction, laughing. He laughed. I paused a little, hearing his footsteps get quieter, until I thought I wouldn't be so visible to him if I moved and threw myself forward. I ran, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but I was also aware that I was getting further and further away from home. I knew there had to be a stream somewhere close. If I found the stream, I can follow it as it borders the land and runs parallel to some of the footpaths. I ran until the trees finally cleared, and I can just make out another field through them on the other side. I thank God, and I push myself a little bit further till I'm out of the trees. The ground disappears from below my feet, and I go head over shoulders down the stream embankment. I crash into the water below. As I sputter it out, I feel both relieved to have found the stream and terrified that he's heard me. My phone is now ruined. I slowly make my way downstream as quiet as possible, listening for him the whole time as the stream borders the woods, looking up periodically just in case. After a while, maybe a half hour, I notice the trees begin to thin out and realize this is the edge of the woods where I would have been exiting and where my pathway connected to the original one I'd started on. If I ran, I could get home in less than 20 minutes. As quiet as I could, I dragged myself on my stomach back up the embankment, army style, wanting to stay as low as possible. I peek over the top. I could just barely make out the opening of the woods exit path about 50 feet away. I sat and scanned the forest line for a couple of minutes, my eyes trying to make out movement despite it now being pitch black. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything either. I pushed myself up and sprinted as fast as I could across the field onto the pathway. I knew the gate that I'd entered through was in the adjoining field. It really wasn't far. I was so happy. I hear a screech from across the field. I swore my legs nearly gave out then and there. He had been waiting for me. I turned my head and saw him sprinting out of the woods at full pelt. I yelled and pushed myself further, tears coating my face. All I could do was run. I crossed into the main field now and I could see the moonlight shining off the metal gate. My house was just 5 minutes away after that. I have never focused on anything as much as that gate. He was faster than me and getting closer, yelling at me the whole time. I ran, pushing myself up and over the gate, and ran up the road. I dared look as I made the turn from my road. He was still following me. I raced up my driveway and threw myself into the door, running into the living room crying, yelling hysterically. My dad ran outside while my mom grabbed a hold of me as I collapsed, shaking. As it turns out, my parents had already called the police. As I said, I was going out for an hour or so at 7, and it was now past 12, and I hadn't answered when they had called my now broken phone. We called the police again to explain. They came and I gave a full statement. Both my parents and the police were surprised. Nothing like this happens here. There hasn't been a major reported crime in at least 100 years. But one look at me and it was obvious I was telling the truth. I was covered head to toe in marks, soaking wet and covered in mud. I won't go into how this experience changed me. It's depressing. But I will say the thing that scares me the most is that they never even had a suspect. Despite him following me so closely, he was gone by the time my dad ran outside. That guy is still out there, and who knows what he's really capable of. On a weekend in the fall, a friend asked me if I wanted to go camping. I'm definitely not an outdoors person, nor do I enjoy being in the forest. I agreed though, because I felt bad since this friend had asked me before and I declined. As soon as I agreed, I immediately regretted it. I honestly don't even know where we were, but my friend drove for hours away from the town we were living in at the time. The forest was so thick it was literally what you see in scary movies. My friend told me I was being a wimp, but I got a weird vibe from the whole situation. We had arrived in the evening, so by the time we put up our tent, it was dark. "What is that?" I asked when I pointed to the number written on the tent. 4054. "I don't know, something that was there when we bought it," my friend said. I didn't think much of it, but I was still creeped out by the fact that we were literally in the middle of nowhere. I woke up, and I'm guessing it was around 3 in the morning, and I heard what sounded like someone making strange noises, almost animalistic. My friend sat up and looked at me. I was about to ask if he heard it too, when we heard branches snapping right behind the entrance of our tent. I could see someone's shadow right through it. They were crouched down, sitting right next to us. I guess I was thinking of calling the cops because I grabbed my phone, but there was no cell service. The person left and my friend and I were too scared to try to leave. Then we heard something else. The tent was being unzipped, but slowly. One zip at a time, like it was in slow motion. "Get out of here," my friend yelled, throwing something at the entrance. It actually worked and the person ran off. Again, the animalistic noises occurred at this point. Let's make a run for the car. I glanced out of the tent to see the car way in the distance. Windows smashed and tires popped. We're stuck, literally trapped. My friend was freaking out. "We'll walk in the morning to try to get cell service. Then we'll call one of my other friends to come get us," I remember saying. The wait for morning seemed excruciating. We didn't sleep at all that night, and I kept hearing branches snap. Finally, at the first light, we quickly peeked out of the tent and decided to walk to get cell service. When we got outside the tent, I was scared. Where the tent said 5054, someone had crossed it out with red marker, then wrote underneath it, "Tent 4054 is no more," with tons of exclamation points. My friend and I kept walking closer to get out of the forest and finally got cell service. When we finally had our friend come pick us up, we were telling him the entire story. "See what they did to the car?" As I pointed to the damaged and ruined vehicle, I saw someone dramatically sit up. They had reclined the passenger seat, and when I looked, they were sitting perfectly upright as the seat rose up. They turned and looked out the window straight at us. A huge, animated smile was on the man's face. All of us were freaked out, and our friend drove away quickly. I still think of tent 454 is no more. I don't want to know what that was supposed to mean. In March of 2003, when I was 17, my brother and I took a weekend camping trip to the Los Padres National Forest. We had gone there many times with our family for day camping, swimming, and just lounging around. This time, though, we went alone for a 2-night camping trip at our favorite spot that most locals simply called the Gorge. We will never forget this weekend for all the wrong reasons. We got there Saturday morning around 9 a.m. and hiked the 5 miles out to the Gorge. The Gorge is a large swimming hole with a huge 60-foot rock cliff boulder that visitors love to jump from into the deep water below. The jumping rock cliff is very steep, and one must jump in a specific location below to ensure they do not hit the rocks protruding from the wall face. The area has many primitive camping spots and is overall a beautiful yet isolated place. The first day was very fun, and after a long day of swimming, catching crawdads, jumping from rocks, and just relaxing, we set up our tent, made a fire, ate our cans of SpaghettiOs and a few crawdads we had cooked for dinner. Towards the end of dinner, we were visited by a large group of students who were camping further down the river. They stated they were students from the Bay Area who had a few nights left in their almost 2-week-long school camping trip. We offered them some chips and snacks and chatted a bit with them before they made their hike back to their camping spot. It soon got dark and my brother and I got ready for bed. My brother was 2 years younger than I and had a deep fear of isolation. So we slept in the same tent and agreed that we would keep the fire burning the entire night to ease his anxiety. We put 5 large logs onto the fire and crept inside our tent and got into our sleeping bags. We both fell asleep very fast as we were exhausted from the day. Around 2:30 in the morning, we were both awoken by a large splash of water near our tent that put out our fire. We heard no voices and could not see much from inside our tent. We froze in terror. My brother began to cry and I tried to calm him down. I told him that I would go outside to investigate and that everything would be okay. I told him that our water bladder must have fallen off the tree where we had hung it, and I'm sure it was some kind of coincidence. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped our tent, and stepped outside. I pointed the flashlight over the fire pit and saw 4 large men sitting around our fireplace staring at me, with what I can only describe as expressionless faces. It appears as though they had split open our 2-gallon water bladder that we had hung over the tree and had thrown it into the fire. I was in shock and I didn't know what to say. For about 5 seconds, none of them said anything. We just stared at each other. Then one of them said in a deep voice,
"Get your friend out here."
Then I heard my brother hyperventilating and screaming in our tent in a way that made me feel helpless. I had no weapons and my brother and I were outnumbered 2 to 1. I asked the men what they wanted and told them that we could just leave and that we were sorry if we had taken their camping spot or invaded their area. They ignored my question and just stood up. That is when I saw 2 of the 4 men were holding something in their hands. Long swords shaped in appearance like a machete or a small sword, but they looked homemade and very primitive. The men yelled at us to get our asses up with them. I thought for a second they might be rangers getting mad at us for having too big of a fire, but once I glanced at their clothing and saw their baggy pants and their black and gray hoodie type clothing, I knew we were not that lucky. I had heard in the past that drug dealers or the Mexican cartel had been caught hiding large amounts of marijuana plants in the forest and wondered if these people were some of the men who somehow felt that we were a threat to their crops. I was in fear of our lives. The men didn't directly touch us or threaten us with violence, but I definitely felt an implied threat in their tone and believed that we really had no choice in the matter. My brother, who was still crying, and I followed the lead male while the other 3 men fell back behind us. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and was visibly shaking. He then whispered to me that we were walking in the direction of the 60-foot rock cliff and that we needed to run. I was petrified and had not been paying attention to where they were leading us, but realized he was right. I stopped dead in my tracks and said to the men, "What are you going to do to us?" The lead male stated,
Nothing, but we're just gonna have some fun with you guys.
I felt that we really had no choice but to do what they said, and hoped that they were all merely screwing with us and that this would be all over soon. After about 30 seconds of walking, we arrived to the jumping spot on top of the boulder, overlooking the gorge swimming area. One of the men stated,
Have you guys ever jumped from here?
I told them that yes, I had, but my brother had not, since it was a pretty high jump and was very dangerous for most people due to the height and the rocks below. The men laughed again and called my brother a pussy. I told them that we were not, as I had jumped from the spot before, but that it was not safe to do in the dark. The men then formed a half circle around us, and one of the men said,
I want to see. Show us that you are not a bunch of pussies.
I screamed at them that it was too dangerous at night, and during the day it was dangerous enough. I told them that there are many rocks that you have to avoid, and that if you did not jump correctly, it could kill you. I pleaded and pleaded. The men just laughed and took a few steps closer to us. I was beyond scared and could hear my heart beating through my ears. My brother at this point was crying loudly and saying things I could not understand. He was beyond terrified, and so was I. I grabbed his hand and told him we needed to get away from these men as we were in great danger. I told him that I had jumped off the rock boulder into the water before and knew where to jump, and that if he jumped with me, we would be okay. I told him I would use my flashlight to help guide us, and I would tell him where to put his feet and how far to jump. The men laughed at us as we had our conversation and showed zero humanity or pity. I grabbed my brother and placed his feet with my hand onto a specific place on the rock ledge where I remember jumping from last time I was there months before. I explained to him that I knew he was scared and so was I, but we needed to jump out as far as we can and slightly to the right, otherwise we would hit the rocks. He was shaking, crying, and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on the floor. The men laughed and kept saying they couldn't believe how scared we were. I then told my brother that we needed to jump now, and that it would be okay if he listened to me. I told him that after we jumped, we would swim to the shore on the right, and would hide in the bushes until daybreak, and would then go for help. I then grabbed his hand tightly and told him that when we hit the water, he needed to tuck his legs and arms in, so that they would not get hurt from the impact of the water, and instructed him that he needed to swim hard to the surface as we would sink pretty far down due to the height we were jumping from. I grabbed his hand and we jumped. I pulled him hard with me to ensure that we would be safe from the rocks below, and that he jumped far enough out. We fell for what seemed like a minute, but was only a few seconds in reality. My brother yelled all the way down in a way I have never heard from another human being before. Terror, dread, and fear of imminent death reverberated from his voice. I felt helpless and almost forgot where we were for those few seconds. Then we hit the water. As soon as we hit, I lost my grip on my brother's hand, but I did hear a second impact in the water. I swam towards the surface with all my energy and took a deep breath. I then listened for my brother to surface, but heard nothing. I panicked and dove into the water to try to grab him. Just as I dove, I felt his leg brush against my hand and realized that he was about to surface. I swam up again and heard my brother. He was crying and kept telling his arm hit the rock and he couldn't feel it anymore. The men above were laughing again and I heard one of them say,
"They fucking made it, those idiots."
I then heard objects splashing in the water around us and realized they were throwing beer bottles or rocks or some other hard objects at us. I quickly grabbed my brother and helped him swim to the nearby shore. The whole time we swam, many objects landed dangerously close to us, and I felt that if any had hit us, it would have caused death or great bodily harm to us, especially if we were hit in the head. My flashlight had been lost in the fall and we were in complete darkness. We reached the water's edge and I pulled my brother to shore. Objects continued to rain down around us and we could hear the men yelling and laughing. I told my brother that we needed to run. He was crying and holding his injured arm that he could not feel or use it. It had a deep cut around the elbow, and even with just the starlight we could see that this was a serious injury. We stumbled down the tree line and began making our way through the darkness to one of the main trails from past memory. We fell again and again and were cut by branches and rocks all over our bodies as we wandered about down the overgrown trail. Everything in my body told me to keep going and to get as far away from these men as we could. We walked for many minutes until we could no longer hear the men, and we waited. I wrapped my brother's arm with my shirt and told him that it was over and that all we had to do was wait until morning for help. We sat in that spot all night and my brother cried and shook for hours. I just put my arm around him and patted his head, as I did when we were children whenever he had a panic attack and our parents were not around. At daybreak we could finally see the severity of his injuries. He had a deep gash in his arm and his shoulder was obviously dislocated. I helped him hike up the nearby trail, and we walked all the way back to the base camp ranger station. We explained what happened to the rangers and they sent 2 armed officers to go investigate the location. My brother was sent to a nearby hospital for treatment, and I joined him on the ambulance ride over. The rangers and the police never found the men, but did retrieve most of our gear. The scary thing about this incident is that the same week, 2 teenage boys were found dead at the bottom of the gorge jumping area, and that their group had encountered the same people as we did at their camping location, with similar machete objects, who chased them off their camping spot. I am glad to be alive, and my brother and I have never gone camping alone again, or have never been back to that location. All that we have left from the incident are scars on my brother's arm, hospital bills, and a lot of trauma. An article of the death of the 2 teenage boys is below. I can only hope their deaths were accident, as the authorities ruled. I did not find out about their deaths until 7 years after, but was horrified about the similar circumstances and timing of the 2 events. As to the men that forced us to jump that day, let's not meet again. Every summer, my family makes the trip from Texas to Vermont. 2 summers ago, my parents bought a new home, and for some reason, our house smelled really, really terrible. So, my mom went to the local candle and scent shop and ended up bonding with the woman who owned it. She convinced her to give me a summer job. The first month went smooth, with really only a few bad customers. One day I was checking inventory in the back when I heard the bell above the door ring. I walked to the front of the store, calling out to whoever just entered, but no one replied to me or appeared to be in the store. So I just forgot about it and moved on with my day, blowing it off as the wind. That night, when I was getting into my car, I found a piece of notebook paper stuffed in the space between the slit of rubber in my window. It had my full name and a crudely drawn picture of a wedding ring. What the hell? I blew this off as my best friend and coworker, Courtney, trying to scare me like she always did. The next day at work, I told Courtney that she wasn't funny. She told me that she didn't do anything. Courtney always owns up to her pranks. After that, I was creeped out, but again dismissed it as another one of my friends. I was sitting at the register playing on my iPhone when I heard someone walk into the shop. I looked up to see a rugged man at the counter. I was a 4'11" teenage girl, and this man towered over me at least a foot.
"Are you Sarah M?"
He said this in a deep, slow voice. I had never seen this man before in my life, so how could he know my name? I didn't know what to do, so I remained silent and started to slowly back away from the counter, grabbing my phone, heading towards the back exit.
"I'm sorry about the note in your car. I was just too nervous to ask you out.
At this point, I was about to nope the hell out of there, but I knew I couldn't just leave the shop unattended with the creep in there. My boss would literally murder me, and maybe he will leave anyway. I'm really sorry, but I have a boyfriend back home and I'm 16. I tried my best not to sound intimidated, although I probably sounded like a chipmunk that pissed itself.
Well, you look like a girl that hasn't had good fun in a while.
I didn't know what to do. I started to pull the mace out of my pocket. I think I'm okay on that, but you should leave, sir, before I call the police. At this, he looked like he would kill, and tried to pull me over the counter. He had me in a tight grip and he tried to pull a small kitchen knife out of his pocket. But before a second thought, I pepper sprayed him directly in the face. He loosened his grip and I grabbed my phone and bolted to my car. I locked myself in the car and called 911. It would be 10 minutes until the police could get to my location. The operator told me to start my car in case he got up. I tried to start my car, but it wouldn't budge. My one thought was, in what way will I be cut up? I could hear the police car pull into the parking lot. When the police found the man inside the shop, he was crying behind the counter. Apparently, this man had stalked me for 3 summers. He lived in a cabin in the mountains, and he hadn't talked to anyone for 10 years, and he had severe mental problems. A few years ago, he saw me and my family hiking through the woods and felt that we were meant to be, a match made in heaven, in his opinion. A few weeks later, I had my car looked at. The throttle had been missing, explaining why my car wouldn't move when I tried to start it. I still go to work at the scent shop, but I'm now 21 and married. I wonder where he is now, but please, Mountain Man, let's not meet again. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather some samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my university in the Pacific Northwest. There are 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the 5 students who had eaten the soup were not in the best shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning, and were in no shape to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us had originally some rules, such as traveling in groups of at least 2, and we had to return to camp by nightfall. Now, those rules were tossed out to make sure we kept our timetable to collect all the required samples. We were told to do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning, I set out for a long day of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into the stream I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of water and soil. This meant I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day, I realized that wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful until I smelled the cigarettes. It wasn't the smell of the cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car where cigarette butts have been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around but couldn't see anyone. I just assumed the wind had blown the scent from some hunter or hiker over to me, but minutes later, the smell hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there were still a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or a bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staying so close enough to me for me to smell them this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up the trash from my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelt it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to the camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous. even without a cigarette-smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes in my back, I shined my flashlight around the darkened woods looking for whoever was giving off the smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. I would actually be more correct to say that I saw too many things in the dim light that may have been a head sticking out from behind a tree or someone crouching low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who, for the second time, was lurking near me without revealing themselves. So, I began to double time it back to the stream. I made much better time on the way back even though it was dark because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to the camp till a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor because he seemed tired as it was, and he headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back. I headed to my tent soon after. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head in the woods to do my business as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill and needed the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods, found a tree, and did what I needed to do. As I turned back to the camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods was a tiny, red glow. I was confused as to what it was until it flared momentarily and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while watching the red ember glow, fade, then move slightly closer to the ground as to whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see the person, I assumed that they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light. I made my way slowly back to the camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier in the day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke up the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning, and we took turns watching over the camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty, and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker had been standing the night before, and sure enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to the tree. The tree itself looked like someone had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp object into it, as the bark and the outer layers of the wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day even though we hadn't collected all of the samples we were assigned, to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway though, a white paneled van pulled out of the clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. The van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van hadn't followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple hours before I left the biological science building and started heading toward the dorm building I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get into his car and drive home. It was a couple dozen feet outside the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with the musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards away in the darkness, off the footpath, I saw a cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this, as the musty cigarette smell was the same as what I smelled in the woods the previous night. I started down the footpath and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. That is until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white paneled van parked alone in the parking lot. I took off at a sprint towards my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run. I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall to the ground and the dark shape beginning to move after me. I didn't look back, but I could hear someone running in the grass off the footpath. I got to the entrance of my dorm building and frantically waved my key card in front of the key reader that controlled the door lock. As soon as I hear the soft beep, I open the door, jump in, and shut the door quickly. I stopped and peered through the glass door. I saw the dark shape stop short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light is just barely bright enough to illuminate the shaggy beard and brim of a baseball cap before it disappears and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I get to my window overlooking the same yard I had just ran through, there is no trace of a dark figure or the light of a cigarette. After that, I didn't see the white paneled van again or smell that musky cigarette smell. I hope I never do. For some background, this happened back in 2003 when I was 6 years old. I'm from Michigan and this experience takes place over the summer. In the area I live in, we have a community pool that everyone who lives in the community is welcome to use. A special event this pool throws is called a midnight swim. The whole point of this is for the pool to be open till midnight. The pool usually closed at 9 p.m. Sunday through Thursday, and 10 p.m. on Friday and Saturday. The midnight swims were held on Friday nights. There are 3 midnight swims held each year I always looked forward to. Before you think I had bad parents for letting 2 6-year-olds stay out swimming until midnight, my brother and I were both excellent swimmers, since we had learned how to swim at age 3. And for being out till midnight, well, we lived in a safe neighborhood where nothing bad ever happened. On this particular day, we had to wait until 9 p.m. before we could go to the pool because my parents had to work late, and our sitter didn't want to leave the house and take us to the pool. So, 9 o'clock rolls around and my brother and I are ready to go. My parents get home and get ready themselves. As my parents are getting ready, me being my 6-year-old self gets bored and decided to wait for them out on the front porch. A little layout of my neighborhood. There is a main road just to the left of my house. Anyways, I'm walking around on my front lawn when I hear a voice call out to me saying,
"Hey kid, come over here."
At first, I thought the voice was coming from inside my head. Don't judge me, I was 6. But after hearing the voice call out a few more times and looking around, I spot a man standing in the shadows of some trees. My parents had taught me not to talk to strangers, but I was standing right in front of my house and I thought it would be safe. I asked the man what he wanted and he said he wanted to show me something. Realizing that there was something strange with how the man hadn't come out of the shadows, I told the man no and I was going back inside. The man didn't like this one bit. He scolded me for not listening to my elders and to do what he said. At this point, I was shocked. I didn't expect this man to yell at me, but I stupidly decided to not go inside and stay on the porch. I told the man that I didn't know him, to which he replied that he was a friend of my parents and that they wouldn't mind me going over to talk to him. It was at this point my dad had walked out and asked me who I was talking to, but by the time I had pointed to the trees, the man was gone. So, to the man that tried to lure a 6-year-old boy into the woods, let's not meet ever again. In October of 2008, the body of an 11-year-old boy was discovered under a shallow layer of vegetation over 50 miles from his home. A group of hunters found him laying on top of a hill in Logan Creek State Forest, located in Reynolds County, Missouri, near the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. The remains were turned over to local law enforcement, where they were DNA matched to Billy Evanston, who was reportedly missing in the summer of 2005. He was later positively identified by members of his family. An autopsy failed to provide sufficient answers to the many questions this case presented. Evanston's was the 5th body associated with what authorities dubbed the Logan Creek incidents. Each victim was found in the same forest and bore particular similarities. Evanston was no exception. First, despite having been in the woods for over 3 years without any kind of preservation methods undertaken, the body showed no signs of decay. There was no obvious cause of death. However, an autopsy revealed that there was no blood anywhere in his circulatory system, and tissue damage to blood vessel walls led the medical examiner to believe that it somehow combusted and burned away without damaging other parts of the body. Also, in each one of the victims, the optic nerve inexplicably appeared to have been severed. A disposable camera was discovered with Billy Evanston's corpse, along with a pocket-sized composition notebook belonging to 17-year-old Eric O'Neill, the first victim of the Logan Creek incidents. His body was discovered in 1997, but there was no other evidence found. It is unknown why or how the notebook reached the opposite side of the forest as O'Neill's, but graphological analysis revealed the handwriting inside belonged to him. The notebook, camera, and a series of drawings attributed to the third victim, 7-year-old Jennifer Marlowe, discovered in 2001, form the entire foundation of this case, as documentation of the events leading up to the other victims' deaths have not yet been found. The film in Evanston's camera was developed and the pictures thoroughly reviewed by an investigation team. 8 photographs were taken. The remaining 16 left on the reel are blank. 3 highly accredited photo forensic analysis agree that the images were in no way altered with. The investigative team worked tirelessly to match descriptions from O'Neill's book to each photo. These excerpts bear striking similarities to the photographs, even though they were written 8 years before the photographs were taken. These similarities helped investigators piece together a rough timeline all the Logan Creek victims likely followed. Photograph 1, dated July 8th, 2005. This is a photo from Billy Evanston's 11th birthday party, where his mother gave him the camera as a gift. The young boy is seated at his kitchen table, surrounded by a group of children from his class. A cake reading "Happy Birthday, Billy" sits in front of him. His father is pictured lighting the candles. His mother is the photographer. Photograph number 2, dated July 11th, 2005. This image shows the Evanstons' backyard at dusk, captured by Billy's bedroom window on the 2nd floor. Billy is believed to have taken this picture. At first glance, there is nothing out of the ordinary, but upon further inspection, 3 slender gray, figure-like digits can be seen curled over Billy's window. The owner of the limb is not pictured and remains unidentified. Corresponding journal entry, dated November 30th, 1997. I have no idea where I am. It feels like someone is driving an ice pick into my left eye, and my memory is fuzzy. The only thing that I can remember is the end of the dream I had last night. I was in bed and heard something from outside in the middle of the night. I know that it was a dream because it was daylight, like brighter than the sun daylight. But in the middle of the night, I got out of bed and went to the window. When I stuck my head out to look around, everything went dark. Then at least 4 hands clamped down on my shoulders and yanked me forward and then drug me upward. I'm in the woods now. I've wandered around all day. I am completely lost. I haven't seen any other hikers, campers, or any other human beings, and it's getting dark. Sometimes I can hear footsteps behind me, but when I turn around, I can't see anything. There aren't even any animals or bugs. Photograph number 3, dated July 15th, 2005. Taken the day Billy was reported missing by his parents, this is the first photograph of Logan Creek State Forest. Billy's parents stated that they had no idea how he got there. They say they had put him into bed the night before and could not find him the next morning. His window was open, but there was no signs of forced entry or an intruder. Billy's disappearance at the time was ruled a kidnapping. The picture shows a perfectly circular clearing in an otherwise densely forested area. What little vegetation remains appears to be in the process of turning to dust. A thick blanket of gray ash covers the clearing completely, but cannot be found outside of the border of the circle. 3 trees stand untouched in the center. Original speculation pointed to a fire in this area of Logan Creek Forest, but it provided no explanation for the geometric pattern of damage or the intact trees left behind. The photographer is unknown, but believed to be Billy Evanston. Corresponding journal excerpt, dated December 4th, 1997. I thought it was ash at first, but our tool shed burned down when I was a kid. This isn't what ash feels like. I'm not sure how else to explain it. Ashes are flaky and almost have a papery texture to them. This stuff feels like sand. There was this weird, static energy or something in the circle. I don't know how else to describe it, but all the hair on my body stood straight up, and I heard this quiet humming coming from the back of my head as I approached the trees. If I stayed there too long, I felt nauseous. I'm taking some of the sand or whatever it is back to have someone look at it if I can ever get home. Photograph number 4, dated July 12th, 2005. This photograph shows a handprint on a tree trunk. It is the same color as the gray clearing, and 3 elongated digits connected to an oval-shaped palm contrasted starkly against the deep brown of the dark tree. Investigators pointed out the similarities between the handprint and the 3 fingers in photograph 2. The photographer is unknown but believed to be Billy Evanston. Corresponding journal entry, no date. I've lost track of how long I've been here. I'm beginning to think that I was not dreaming the night that I was taken. My shoulders were sore and I found purple and green bruises under my shirt. They weren't human hands. They had a thumb of sorts, but only 2 fingers. I took my shirt off and found them all over my torso. Photograph number 5, dated July 14th, 2005. This haunting image appears to have been taken at dusk. Pictured are the branches of several trees in the forest. The photo is blurry, but 6 pairs of glowing eyes peek out among the leaves. Further inspection revealed hunched humanoid figures woven between branches, staring down at the camera. The creatures have yet to be identified. The photographer is unknown, but is believed to be Billy Evanston. Corresponding journal entry, no date. They are watching me. I can't sleep anymore. I just sit on the ground, hugging my knees to my chest and keeping my eyes shut. I can still tell they're looking at me. Sometimes I hear footsteps behind me during the day. I can see a figure out of the corner of my eye for a second. I don't know if I'm getting better at finding them or if they just want me to see them. Photograph number 6, dated July 15th, 2005. This photograph shows 4 lights streaking through the sky above Logan Creek Forest. It closely resembles many other photographs claiming to have captured UFOs or extraterrestrial life. A finger in front of the camera lens covers the top left corner of the frame. The photographer is unknown but believed to be Billy Evanston. Corresponding journal entry, no date. A huge wiring sound, like a jet taking off. They want me to think they're leaving, trying to take my guard down. I've been running now, but the woods just get deeper. There is no way out, but up. Photograph number 7, dated July 15th, 2005. This photograph is of the gray substance, like what was found in the clearing from photograph 3. This one was taken from inside the clearing. The camera is angled down, showing a pair of legs from the knees down. Billy Evanston is believed to have taken the photo, as well as have appeared in it. Particles of the still, unidentified substance coats his feet and seems to be snaking up the rest of his legs. Corresponding journal entry, no date. Please help me. That humming sound is all I can hear. The ground has turned against me, and that gray dust can crawl right up my legs and down my throat. It's hot. It burns. There's no way out, but up. Photograph number 8, dated July 15th, 2005. The last photo on Evanston's camera is by far the most unsettling. Pictured is Billy Evanston being dragged through the forest by 2 unidentified figures, which, though blurry, display striking resemblances to the figures from photograph 5. They are not facing the camera. The figures appear to be tall, but hunched over. Evanston's mouth is open as if he's screaming, but his body seems still. Some of the members of the investigative team believe that Evanston was dead when this photograph was taken. The photographer is unknown. Corresponding journal entry, no date. They took me up, but I can't escape. There's no way out. Jennifer Marlowe was reported missing in December 1995, but was not found until March of 2001. When her parents were questioned about her disappearance, they responded the same as the families of the other victims. They had put Jennifer to bed the night before, but there was no sign of her the next morning, no evidence of a break-in or kidnapping. She had seemingly vanished into thin air. When asked if they noticed any strange behavior before her disappearance, they provided a series of drawings done by Jennifer in the weeks leading up to her abduction. Her parents didn't think anything of the strange creatures depicted. Rather, they thought it was fueled by the 7-year-old's imagination or too many science fiction movies. The drawings contain various everyday scenes such as family portraits, busy streets, and Marlo's backyard, but blended in with the normal events are gray figures with elongated digits resembling those described by Eric O'Neill and photographed by Billy Evanston. Sometimes they are waving, sometimes they held their hand to their side, but one of their arms was always extended with one finger pointing upward. Originally, investigators believed this to be a kidnapping, an unfortunate abduction resulting in the murder of a child, but a prevalent crime nonetheless. However, the inexplainable details of the Logan River incidents have led several investigators to explore the idea of some sort of supernatural involvement. No bodies have been discovered since Billy Evanston's, but it is still unclear which of the thousands of current missing persons will return home and which will end up in the Logan Creek State Forest. Jefferson National Forest lies just north of Blacksburg, Virginia. My absolute favorite part of the forest is Panda Pass Pond. The pond itself is scenic and beautiful, but the best part is the miles and miles of hiking trails accessible from the pond. I try to hike between 3 to 6 miles per week. I do this for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's great exercise, and secondly, because it helps keep me sane. Today, however, the sanity part changed. Today, just like I do every week, I packed a few bottles of water and a collapsible water bowl for my dog Lana and headed for the pond. When I parked, I noted 6 or 7 cars in the parking lot and thought about how I'd for sure need to keep Lana close to me so she wouldn't bother any of the other hikers or pond goers. I always turn on a hiking app on my phone as soon as I get out of the car. The app helps me gauge the distance I've hiked, and most importantly, it helps ensure that I don't get lost. For any of you that may have knowledge of the area, you know that it's borderline impossible to get lost in these trails, but I like to have the security. I got out of the car, shouldered my bag, grabbed the dog leash and turned on the app. I was greeted with the familiar start workout and I began walking towards the pond. Everything seemed perfect, the temperature was cool, the sky was overcast for the first half mile and I was completely alone. As Lana and I rounded a bend, we saw another hiker. This hiker was a man in his early to mid-20s and was moving. His eyes were wide and unblinking and he looked nervous. He was running, but I doubted I would have been able to keep up with him. Lana and I stepped aside to let him pass and I offered a friendly good morning. This guy never stopped looking ahead. He never even acknowledged my existence. As he passed, I pulled out my phone to get a video of his odd behavior and I noticed I had absolutely no service. My hiking app's GPS showed me standing on a blank map. My mile per minute tracker had skyrocketed to 2 hours per mile and was steadily climbing. I turned the app off to save battery and I decided I would just stick to the trails I already knew. When I finally reached the pond, it was a ghost town. Usually there are older couples and moms pushing jogger strollers around the pond loop, but today there wasn't a soul in sight. The combination of the deserted pond and the strange wide-eyed hiker was giving me an uneasy feeling, and for a moment I considered turning around and heading home. As I was standing there contemplating on what to do next, I felt Lana pulling enthusiastically on her leash. Okay, Lana, let's go," I said as we moved forward. There's this section of pond loop that forces you to cross a wooden bridge. The bridge separates the pond and a small section of marshland. Usually when you cross it, you can hear bullfrogs bellowing and see ducks swimming around lazily. Today, though, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, nothing. I found it a little unnerving, but as we were so close to the trail, I decided to push on. We took our usual route, Lady Sniper Trail to Joe Pye Trail to Poverty Creek Trail. Usually, once we hit Poverty Creek Trail, we take a right and head back to the car. But today, with such perfect hiking weather, I decided to take a left and try a new trail I'd never been on before. I double-checked my location on the post-trail map and I decided I would follow Poverty Creek Trail to Royale Trail, then loop back towards the parking lot about halfway down Royale. As soon as I turned left onto Poverty Creek, I experienced the worst case of vertigo I've ever experienced. I leaned on a low-hanging branch for a few minutes to try to regain my composure. When I finally felt normal again, I decided to snap off a branch and use it as a walking stick, just in case the vertigo came back. The branch gave me a ton of resistance before finally coming off. However, it didn't make a sound. I stopped and stared at the branch that should have come off with an ear-shattering crack, and I realized I couldn't hear anything other than my own breath. I looked up to the sky, barely visible through the canopy of trees. The sky was getting a lot darker than when I first stepped onto the trails. I felt my heart racing. Calm down, it looks just like it's gonna rain. That's why you don't hear any animals, I thought to myself. For some stupid reason, I decided to keep going. I could have, and most definitely should have turned around, but I kept going and turned onto Royale Trail. After about 15 minutes of walking, and hearing only the sound of Lana panting, I figured I should be close to the point where I loop back and get out of the woods. Another minute or two of walking presented me with a trail that headed into the general direction I needed to go. The trail was unmarked, unlike all the other trails. Whatever, just get out of these woods before you get stuck here in the rain. I said this out loud, mostly just to break the silence. This unmarked trail looked pretty well traveled, so I assumed it was okay. I assumed so very wrong. The trail quickly narrowed to nothing more than a deer trail, but it was going the way I needed to go. I decided to follow it. The vegetation started to get really thick, and I had to duck my head so I didn't get hit in the face by stray branches, barreling through the bushes like I should have been, loud enough to wake the dead. But instead I heard nothing but my own heavy breathing. Suddenly I fell through the brush into a clearing. On my hands and knees, I started to laugh how crappy this hike was going and looked over at Lana. She was frozen in place. All of her hair was raised and her teeth were bared. She looked straight ahead and let out a low growl. I looked up, hoping it was just a deer or a rabbit. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing stood a man in camouflage. He was facing away from me with his head down. Lana growled again and I saw the man's head perk up. "Run," he said in a low, gruff voice. I ran, faster than I thought my feet could carry me, little Lana somehow matching my stride. As I silently crashed through the brush, I turned to see if the man was following us. He was, but he wasn't running, but still seemed to be gaining on me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, he was a little closer. I could see his eyes, but he flashed an unpleasant white smile as he gained on us. I knew that I had to be close to 460, the highway that runs through the forest, and I knew if I could just make it to the pavement that I'd have a chance of making it home.
"Run, little piggy,"
the man taunted just behind me. I saw the highway and changed direction. My legs screamed for me to stop, and every breath I took felt like broken glass was filling my lungs. I dove through the tree line and heard the man laugh as I crash-landed onto the shoulder of 460. I scrambled to my feet and turned around just in time to see the man melt back into the woods. The last part of him I saw was that white smile. The silence that I had been in for the better part of an hour stopped. The sound of passing cars and semi-trucks suddenly blasted me, and I realized I was safe. I looked around and got my bearings and realized I was still at least 2 miles from my car. I started walking back towards the parking lot, making sure to keep ample distance between myself and the tree line. During breaks in the passing cars, I could hear twigs snapping and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finally made it back to my car. I was shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice trying to unlock the door. As I was closing my car door, I heard the man's eerie taunt again.
"Run, little piggy."
I've come to the decision that I will never hike there again. I live in the mountains about 10 miles outside of a small town, near a winding backroad highway well known for its many accidents. A lot of which happen to be collisions with animals, deer, small rodents, and sometimes more often than not, mountain lions. I grew up in the country my whole life, so I've seen just about every animal my side of the state has to offer, whether alive or roadkill. Recently, I saw one that I could neither identify or rationalize. My husband and I had stopped by for dinner with his coworkers in town down the winding road from our home. Once it grew close to midnight, I knew we should be getting home. My husband insisted he wanted to stay a little bit longer to have a drink with his buddy. Reluctantly, I agreed he could stay, even though he knows I hate going home late at night by myself. We have about a half a mile of driveway leading to our home, which is blocked off by a padlocked gate. I get paranoid every time I have to get out of my car to unlock the gate pull inside, and then relock the gate behind me. Not that I'm afraid of something attacking me, but way up in the country a wild animal mauling me. The number of mountain lions and bears in our area was definitely above average. I headed back home alone, my husband promising he'd only be out for another hour. I took the dangerous road extra cautiously in the evening. The thick cover of trees surrounding the road made it pitch black. After finally arriving at my road, I hit the gravel fast, eager to get inside. What I saw next made me slam on my brakes so hard I fishtailed a bit and scattered gravel every which way. What I saw barely 2 feet in front of my car was incomprehensible. It looked almost like a human figure at first. Its ribs stuck out so far it took a barrel shape. It was hunched over, but if it stood up straight it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Tufts of matted hair all over its body. What skin shone through appeared to be mangled. Long limbs resembling human arms, but too thin and discolored. Its legs arched like wolves. It had no sign of a human face. The face it had seemed to be a snout that contained a sharp set of canine teeth that shone and snarled at me. My eyes locked with its piercing yellow eyes. It stared me down for what felt like an eternity. Then all of a sudden it broke our gaze, swiftly disappearing into the woods. I was so scared I sat in my car until my husband arrived home after an hour later. He had to knock on my window to get my attention. He questioned me about it once we were in the safety of our own home. I've been dealing with paranormal experiences with spirits since I was a child, but my husband says he has never seen me this shook up before. I'll take a ghost over that creature any day. This is a story I was told by one of the other guides who had spent around 6 years guiding canoe trips in the Lake of the Woods. Let's call him Steven. I want to remind you that I did not experience this, but Steven had told me about a few experiences he and the other guides he worked with had. What I do want you to know is that we do not joke around about Wendigos or skinwalkers at our workplace. We do not tell these stories to our campers anymore, and we don't even say their name but refer to them only as W or S. This is not something that we joke about or just make up to scare campers. I'm not an expert in Wendigos or skinwalkers or Native American culture by any means, and I hope not to offend anyone, but the knowledge that I have on them has been passed down by guides and their experiences. One detail that I should explain before I tell Steven's story is that a definite way to tell that you are seeing a Wendigo or a skinwalker is if the animal or creature has 2 bright, glowing red or yellow eyes. One summer, about 5 to 6 years ago, Steven had a couple encounters with the Wendigo. His first encounter was on an earlier trip in the summer, where their destination was into Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip, which had about 60 miles of paddling, and taking your packs and canoes over the land to another lake, into Shoal. On day 4, they were going out of Shoal, through a portage called Headman's Portage. Sounds made up from some scary story. No idea why they call it that, but it's quite fitting. There was a campsite that is pretty frequently used about half a mile from the portage. We just called the campsite Headman's. Steven and his trip left Shoal Lake aiming to get through Headman's Portage and stay at the campsite right after it. It's a little long, but a nice highway of portage without too many ups and downs. I believe the Canadian Park Service even clears out this portage, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in the Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is just surreal and beautiful. It's through a little stream, with 10 to 15 foot cliffs on both sides covered in moss and beautiful cedars. Steven and his trip got to Headman's campsite, and later on, just before they were going to bed, they discovered they left their sleeping bag at the end of the portage. It was around 9, so it was getting pretty dark by this point. Steven and a camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps quickly to retrieve the pack. The paddle took them about a half hour, and at this point you could really only see what your headlamp was shining on. They grabbed the bag and started to head back. Shortly after leaving, Steven started to hear loud splashes and things falling from the water behind them. He dismissed it at first because beavers are pretty common in this area, and when they slap their tails it sounds pretty identical to a huge rock being chucked into the water. But the splashes kept going, and were right on his back as they kept paddling. Steven looked behind him to see a huge rock around the size of a baseball come flying at him and land into the water at his side. They began to paddle like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was chucking these giant, super heavy rocks at them. Steven looked back between the paddles, and on one of the cliffs about 15 feet up, he saw 2 distinct red glowing eyes on top of it. The rocks stopped and they made it back okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely without any other occurrences. But I never feel great about going through Headman's Portage, and triple check that I don't have any bags there when I do. This story takes place about 2 years ago. My aunt, married into the family, has cousins, not related to me, who live on a farm in La Pointe, Utah, on a reservation, and thought it would be fun to have all us other cousins go stay with her for a few days and see the Dinosaur National Monument. My aunt's grandmother had recently passed away, and her house was basically empty, so we went to stay there. It was a pretty old house, to say the least. It was made out of painted white cedar blocks and was pretty run down, but we were only staying there a few days, so we didn't care how luxurious it was. The front door led into a small kitchen, and off the kitchen to the right was a small room with a TV, 2 couches, and a chair. Off of that room was a larger living area with 2 more pull-out couches and a door leading to the side of the house. Off the living room was a hall that led into 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. It was a pretty small house considering we had around 18 people staying there. Along with the old and empty house we were staying in, there were 2 other houses on the property belonging to my aunts, cousins, and their families. These were the only houses for about 2 miles. There were 12 kids in total, ranging from 3 to 16, me being the oldest, as well as the 2 other kids who lived in the other houses who wanted to come stay with us. We all slept on the pull-out couches and the floor. Other than the parents, there were 2 other people who were staying there. They were soon to be married, so they were staying there for a few days before the wedding. It was a whole big mess of people, but bear with me. They didn't want to sleep in the same house because they weren't married, and religion and all this crap. So the guy, we'll call him B, was sleeping in the small camper outside while his fiancée slept in one of the bedrooms. Now we can actually get to the creepy stuff. On the first night we were there, me and one of my cousins were on the pull-out couch in the first little room, while all the other kids were either on the other couches or on the floor, in either our room or the other. It was about midnight. Most of the kids were already asleep. We were watching Disney movies and dozing off when we started to hear strange noises outside toward the field. It sounded like low growling and panting, but not entirely like it was coming from an animal. There was just this weird, human-like sound to it. I assumed it was some sort of stray animal, and got up to see when one of the other kids who lived next door, we'll call him L, jumped up and told me just to ignore it and go to sleep. I was really confused and the noises were still happening, but the terrified look on his face told me I should listen. The creature would pace around the house and stop at the door by the kitchen for a few minutes before continuing to circle the house. Neither of us got any sleep that night. The next night was basically the same setup. Kids sleeping everywhere, movies playing, a few people still dozing off. I was exhausted from the night before and managed to fall asleep when I was woken up by one of the youngest kids quietly crying and crawling into bed with me. We'll call him A. I asked him what was the matter, and he said he was scared by the big dog outside the window. I turned to L and asked if they had a dog. He looked completely scared out of his mind and said no, and told me to ignore it once again. I stayed up for a while after that, watching movies with A, when he asked me to walk with him to the bathroom. A little bit of explanation before I continue. This house was shaped like a short L, the bottom part being the kitchen and the 2 living rooms, and where it turns was the hallway with the bedrooms and the bathroom. The bathroom was right at the beginning of the hall. There was a small window to where you could see the wall, where the first living room was, straight ahead, along with a window that you could see through into the living room, where we were sleeping, and then the rest of the house to the left. Anyways, I was walking A to the bathroom and switch on the light when I see it. An extremely tall, dog-like creature standing on its hind legs facing the window looking into the living room. Its fur was matted and its eyes seemed to be almost glowing orangish red. Its hands looked human-like, but with dark fur and long claws. I screamed and the creature ran back around the side of the house on its hind legs. I picked up A and carried him back to the living room to quickly find L closing the curtains. "What was that?" I whispered to L. "I don't know." "If you ignore it, it'll go away," he whispered back. "You've seen it before?" "Only a couple times, but not recently." Our talking woke up Elle's younger sister, and surprisingly, nobody else. I'm guessing she knew what was going on because she seemed just as scared as we were. I sat A down on the bed and turned the TV up louder, drowning out the sounds that the creature was making outside, and hoping to calm A down a bit and take our minds off whatever the hell we just saw. The noises circling the house continued for about another half hour, when they stopped at the back door in the other room. I peered my head around the corner to face the door. The door handle on the first door started to move back and forth. You could see the silhouette of something huge behind it. I rushed over to shut and lock the other door, trying not to wake anyone else. Just as I did, B, guy sleeping in the camper outside, also Elle's uncle, burst through the kitchen door, slamming it behind him. L asked B what was going on, but he didn't want to say another word and rushed down the hall and into the bedroom with his fiancée. He came out holding a shotgun and pulled a chair into the corner of the living room, giving him a view of both the kitchen and the back door. He gave us a look of both terror and anger. He told us to go back to sleep. We didn't. He sat there all night until the noises stopped around sunrise, then went back outside into the camper without saying a word. I'm surprised no one else woke up, and no one else knows what happened that night. The next morning, there were huge paw prints around the house, and B was discussing something with L's dad, who lived in one of the other houses. They both looked concerned and scared. It was very unsettling. We left later that day for reasons I can't remember, but I'm glad we did. I didn't want to spend another night in that house, and I'm pretty sure that what we saw that night was a skinwalker. This story belongs to a friend of mine. He told me this once, and I simply have to tell it. My friend is of Native American heritage, a tribe who settled the North Pacific West Coast. He is quite the character. For one, he is a whopping 6'10", and he has the blackest eyes you could imagine. He always has this frowning face going on, which makes him seem even more intimidating. He is everything but a bad guy. In fact, he is the most gentle of giants. He was working at a gas station up north back in 1992, and he pretty much always worked the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Business wasn't exactly booming at nights, so he was usually watching TV or reading magazines between customers, and there were a few. The area he lived and worked in was deeply associated with all things Native American. There was a potent sense of pride in the surrounding communities, but also a very distinct presence of superstition and old traditions. My friend was no exception. He was a firm believer of the ways of old. This made his encounter even more terrifying. One night, he was sitting as usual, watching TV when a customer entered the gas station. The customer paid for his gas, a pack of smokes, and some soda, and returned to his car. Nothing unusual. But my friend looked out the window toward the customer's car, and he spotted what looked like a huge dog sitting by the edge of the woods. Now, the window was located on the side of the building, some distance from the door, overlooking the pumps and the roof covering it. On the sides of the roof are pretty strong lights, which shine into the gas station. This gives the gas station not only an eerie lighting with the blinds casting long, striped shadows, but also blinds the teller to an extent. As he peered through the window, trying to focus on the dog, it was gone. He didn't think much of it, even if it was a wolf. He was inside, and wolves don't tend to rob gas stations at night. Wolves were common here, but this wolf was huge. He brushed it off and returned to his mindless watching of TV. A couple of hours go by and not a single customer has entered since the last one. He was just about to refill some condiments when he heard a large thud coming from the back. It wasn't inside, he could hear that, but it came from the back. And behind the building they kept the garbage. The gas station had been visited before by the scavenging homeless, but my friend didn't really care. It wasn't his garbage, and it was just garbage. Let them take it. But it kept getting louder. He decided to grab a flashlight and a gun from the office and circle around back to tell whoever ventured there to leave. His presence alone would have scared off anyone, but he wanted to feel safe just in case. He exited through the sliding doors, walking past the window he was just sitting by. As he turned the corner, he shines a light towards the dumpsters. As the cone of light hits the dumpsters, my friend instantly drops the flashlight and the gun. It's the huge dog he saw before, scouring through the garbage. It wasn't a dog, though. It clearly stood on its hind legs, reaching the same height as him. It couldn't be a bear, as it was too gaunt. The creature's eyes had been glowing in the light of the flashlight, making it even more terrifying. He ran inside the gas station and wasn't followed. He locked the door, stayed inside the whole night, and quit the next day. My friend is convinced that he saw a skinwalker, a shape-shifting shaman of sorts, which are a common occurrence in the Native American lore and culture. It's just a really creepy story. I'm not sure what to think of what happened. I may just be overthinking things, or my sister may have just been joking with me. I figured I would share my small story here, in case anyone had any insight on what happened. However, I don't quite believe anything is monstrous, as I suspect to be at fault. I probably just misheard. For perspective, I will tell you that I live out of the southern part of British Columbia, Canada. I live a good hour and a half away from the nearest town by car, and my home is completely surrounded by forest with a few distant neighbors. It is not uncommon for us to see and hear coyotes, wolves, bears, and cougars, so we have a large dog for protection. However, the latest dog passed on, so our new protector is just a puppy and she's not very brave just yet. And I don't think she could have helped the situation if she wanted to. It happened the summer after my graduation. I got a call from one of my neighbors asking if I could tend to her garden while her and her husband went on a fishing trip. I took the walk down the hill with my dog through the brush so that she could lay out the details of specific care her plants would need. My family has known this woman since we moved into our home 20 years ago, and as children we would all go down and visit her, make her cards and chat, and she would allow us to play in her swimming pool in the summer. I trust her completely and have house sat for her before, so it was no odd request for my sister and I to go help out. The garden was new and absolutely beautiful. I have a garden of my own, but it was nothing compared to hers, which was gated and was in pristine condition. The mosquitoes were horrid, so she made her instructions short and I retreated back up the hill to inform my little sister of our assignment. The first day was terribly hot. My sister and I attempted to get up early to evade the heat and bloodsuckers, but in the end they were all sitting in the shade waiting for us to arrive. It took a full hour and a half to completely soak the entire garden, and by then we were sweating, bloody, itchy, and irritable from all of our newfound bite marks. We were supposed to water the garden every morning so that the sun wouldn't dry up the water throughout the day. So I got up early to wake my sister, who after yesterday's assignment refused to go down with me, protesting that she wanted to sleep in and to leave her alone. Not wanting to be held responsible for the demise of my neighbor's veggies, I reluctantly trotted down the path to my neighbor's. Both my dogs were off on some squirrel-infested adventure, so my trek was made alone. Only a few birds that morning until I made it farther down, and the closer I got, the quieter it became. My attention, however, was on the sun, and I wanted to finish my task ASAP. When I was almost done, I took a stretch and went to turn off the hose, wiping the sweat from my forehead. Across the field, from the garden, I thought I heard a person, which would have been very odd, so I stood still to listen. What I heard was my sister calling my name in a shrill voice. My sister and I would often call each other in strange, exaggerated screeches and voices in just that particular way. I knew for a fact that my sister is far too lazy to hike all the way down and sneak through the brush across the field just to yell at me. I listened again, but heard nothing. Finishing up, I assumed I had just misheard, believing it to have been a bird or something, though the odd happening struck in my mind. Later on, I referred the account to my sister, who laughed and joked with me that this must have been the creature her friend told her about. The creature she was referring to was called Wendigo, or Skinwalker. I honestly don't know the difference between the two. I don't know what these creatures are or if they actually exist, but if they were to, they're supposed to live in this kind of area. I put it out of my mind anyway, not believing in such things. The next day I was with my sister tending the garden, and my dog came down to see us. I was shocked to see her paw was all bloody, thinking that she had cut herself on a piece of sheet metal. I ran with her back up to the house to see if I could clean and fix it. My sister didn't want to come up with me, so she stayed in the garden to finish up watering her part. It turned out the blood on my dog's paw was not her own, and that she had simply caught an unfortunate pack rat, whom she delightedly tore to pieces. When I came back, my sister wasn't in the garden. Confused, I began to walk to my neighbor's house when she came outside to meet me. She told me she had heard her name being called from across the field in my voice, in the same way I heard mine. She was visibly spooked and insisted we go back up to our house and leave the garden for tomorrow. I refused and told her she could go up without me if she wanted, but I had to finish the garden. I suspected she was only kidding with me, and I was waiting for her to give up right away, like she normally would. Instead, she stayed with me, holding her arms, and refused to walk home alone. Once we finished, we both came back together for the next 3 mornings to water the garden, and no other occurrences happened. To this day, my sister claims she wasn't lying. I'm not sure if these creatures are supposed to be smart enough or talented enough to pull off stunts so specific. We have lived in the same house in the middle of the woods for our whole lives, and we can be loud and silly without fear of annoying anyone. But if someone or something had been close enough to listen, they definitely had plenty of time to do so. Also, how these occurrences only happened when we were alone gives me goosebumps. If you have any answers for me, I would appreciate any info you have. I won't reveal who I am or much about where I live, and to be honest, it's been a few months since this happened, but I just came to terms with it now. and I have to warn people about what's out there, what they knew, what we don't. Warning, this is a very long read and some of the content below is very disturbing, but I can't hold back, so here's my story. Occasionally, I like to go hiking with my friends. There's not much more to do, honestly. We live in a small mountain town in Colorado. It was fun at first, but by now, we know the trails by heart. By the end of the summer, there was only one we hadn't tried. Now, there's a reason for that. The trail goes right through a portion of the forest that the Ute people consider to be sacred. I'll admit, I have hang-ups when it comes to these things. You don't wear hats in church, you don't let the American flag touch the ground, you don't trudge all over somebody's sacred land for the fun of it. Still, my friend, we'll call him Mark, convinced me to go. He said that regardless of whether I went, he'd go anyway, and since no one else was going, he managed to get me to go with him. That's one of my other hang-ups. Don't go hiking alone. Don't let friends go hiking alone. Too many tragic news stories start that way. So I ended up going with him reluctantly. The whole way there, he was talking about how this was the coolest trail he'd ever been on. Yes, he'd been there before, though only once. His ploy had been to get me to come with him, so he could show me. He admitted this in the casual way that friends admit being jerks to friends. Sometimes I didn't blame him. I had a tendency to have a stick up my butt, and what followed only reinforced it. We arrived at about 9, I remember, giving us plenty of time. It was farther away from the town than most trails, and it wasn't near a paved road, so there was a lot of walking just to get there. No tourists knew about it. A lot of locals and even some Ute didn't know about it. But if you followed a game trail through a bunch of trees, it would widen out and lead its way through some mountains, densely forested terrain. What struck me was how quiet it was. This, apparently, was what Mark found so awesome. For some reason, in this particular place, you couldn't hear any birds chirping or any wildlife whatsoever. It was complete and utter silence. Eventually, I had to go to the bathroom and I stepped off the main road, just so Mark wouldn't see me. As I was going, I spotted something through the trees. It looked like some sort of clearing, just past a shallow creek, with a log going over it. My curiosity got the better of me and I looked at the log. It didn't seem to be an act of nature. It was a makeshift bridge, I was sure. True enough, when I tested it, it seemed to be stable. I put one foot in front of the other and crossed. When I reached the other side, I pulled my way through some trees and saw the first image of the day that I will never forget. Though to many, it wouldn't have seemed like much. In front of me, there was vegetation, trees, ferns, brush, but suddenly, it all stopped. Within a perfect circle, surrounded by small, perfectly arranged rocks, there was nothing but smooth dirt. It was strange, not in the least because the shape of the rocks was absolutely perfect. They were partially submerged in soil and fit together like bricks. Every single one of them was the same uniform white color, and as I got closer, I saw things had been carved on them. Symbols. They were old, very old. Even if I had understood them, their distinct shapes had been lost over the years. That was strange, but what disturbed me was that this circle wasn't actually perfect. On one edge, just one, a group of rocks had been kicked up. They were scattered around, as if they actually had been in a perfect brick wall, and something shattered them. In this area, the otherwise perfectly smooth dirt had been kicked up. There was something about it that just unsettled me. As quiet as the entire forest was, it felt quieter here. I quickly turned around and went back to Mark, who made some lame old number 2 joke. I should have forced him to leave right there. Instead, though, we kept going. After all, the day was only half over. While the forest itself was cool, at least Mark's perspective, I found the trail to be rather disappointing. It just went on and on. There was no alternate paths, and there was hardly any challenging terrain. For Colorado, this whole area was so flat, it was hardly a hike at all. The trail was just long, very long. It took us until noon to reach the end. There was no one else on it. I know that it was a hard trail to find, and many of the other locals might share my sentiments, but we were there all day and we didn't run into anyone. Of course, it wasn't until we reached the end that things started to get really weird. The trail didn't loop at all, and I inwardly groaned, knowing that we would have to walk these same 3 boring hours back. We took our time eating our lunch. As we did, I swear I could hear noises for the first time. There were animals moving through the forest nearby. We could hear the rustling of the brush. I looked and saw through the foliage the vague outline of a single buck's head moving past us. It was odd, but I dismissed it. We packed up what was left of our lunches and start the trek back. Every once in a while, I would hear the rustling again. I'd look into the trees and oftentimes I would see the buck's head. Eventually, though, I noticed it was making far too much noise, and it was doing so far too frequently. Mark told me to slow down and stop, and being Mark, he cracked a joke about it. But finally, he went silent, and we both still heard the rustling. Now even Mark was a little freaked out. He turned around and saw the vaguest outline of the buck's head again. This time, to me, there seemed to be something wrong. The head was far too high up, around the higher branches of the trees. I noticed it. Mark didn't. I should have said something, but I didn't have time. Just as I was there, it was gone again, going off further into the forest. I remember Mark talking about how the deer was annoying as hell, about how he was going to scare it off or something. I don't remember exactly what he said, and that bothers me, because I should remember. He was one of my best friends. I do remember him yelling at it, and at the time it was funny.
Hey Buck, yeah, you, leave us alone.
He walked off the road and disappeared down the ridge, behind a layer of trees, pursuing it. For a minute, there was silence. That minute became 2. Mark? I called out. No answer. 5 minutes pass. I climbed down the ridge after him. Mark. I followed the general direction he had gone in, keeping the way back to the road in my mind. I wouldn't go far. I knew, because he was smart enough to not go far. He hadn't. After a short time, I found a place where there was no signs of struggle. In addition, there was blood. There was a lot of blood. It was all over the trees and all over the ground. I cursed to myself. There were other things too, in addition to the blood. Pieces of flesh that I didn't like to look at. There were marks showing that something had been dragged away from here. Mark, I called out, ferociously now. Forgetting the trail for a second, I ran forward, along the drag marks. After running too far to be safe, I reached a small ravine, with a creek running through it. I narrowly stopped myself. It wasn't a long drop, but it would hurt you, and a sprained ankle in the middle of the forest was bad news. The trail stopped here. Mark, I murmured, then called out again, Mark. I heard something, but it wasn't Mark. Across the ravine from me, I heard rustling and saw the trees stirring. Something stepped through the brush and revealed itself. It was the second image burned into my mind. Please give me a second. I've spent every single day for the past few months trying to tell myself it wasn't real. At first, I saw a head of a buck, but it came forward and I realized that it was at least 7 feet above the ground. I was staring at a 7-foot creature straight in the face that had a massive buck's head, but a humanoid body. The creature snorted. Its buck face remained neutral, scared looking even, as if it wasn't sure of the malicious whims of the body beneath it. There was blood dripping from its horns, which were not like the horns of an average buck, but jagged, pointed, and unorganized. A mess of sharp points. Its human body was dark-skinned and naked. I remember both of its arms and legs. They started human, but near the bottom they distorted and became animalistic. At the end of its legs were powerful hooves. At the end of its arms were hands and very long claws, every bit as jagged as the horns on its head. In one of those claws was Mark's body being held by his shirt. I examined him only briefly, just long enough to notice that the shape of his head was not what it had once been. For a moment there was silence. I didn't scream. I couldn't believe what was in front of me. Then the creature's ears ruffled. It dropped Mark and started backing up. Its deer head hung lazily to the side as it moved. My brain rang. Suddenly, it's going to jump the gap. It's coming for me. With the logical side of my mind shut off, I turned around and ran, hopefully in the exact opposite direction the way I came. Behind me, I heard a powerful grunt, and then a scuffle of the monster landing on the bank. There was a horrifying roar. Something that sounded like a grizzly bear and a buck shouting together. I had never run so fast or so desperately in all of my life, but it was gaining on me, and as I ran through the forest, I started to feel its warm, hungry breath on my back. Its hands were extending, and I swear I could feel its claws scratch me. I ran and scurried up the bank leading to the path. I don't know how I got there without it grabbing me, but I did. Then I took off down the road, hoping I was going the right direction. While running, I threw off my backpack and gained some speed. I think the bank delayed it, slightly. That's the only reason I can account as to how I got in front of it. Somehow, I ran, and ran, and ran. I didn't stop. Eventually, I didn't hear it anymore. But I didn't care. I kept running. I have never been a long-distance runner, but my adrenaline was not going to wear off anytime soon. I intended to take advantage of it. When I reached the end of the trail and saw the road again, I couldn't believe it. I got into my car. Just before I took off, I shot a glance back up the trail, at the point where it went up between the two mountains, and was visible from the road. I would regret it. Standing there at the beginning of the trail was the skinwalker, as I've come to call it. It had given up its chase, but stood there, watching me hungrily, waiting to see if I would come back. Its deer head hung lazily dead to one side. The blood on its body was beginning to dry. It had run the whole trail and didn't look tired at all. I twisted the ignition and floored the car and never came back. They never found Mark, and I would never explain what happened. No one would believe me. I thought I needed to tell someone, which is why I'm posting it here. It came back to me in my dreams, nightmares. That creature, the skinwalker. Somehow, I doubt that forest was really sacred. In fact, I'm sure it was the opposite. Because the image that flashes through my mind most often is not the horrific creature. It isn't Mark's corpse. It's that circle, which must have been maintained over the years by those who knew, those who understood. That old circle, left alone for so long. I'm not being followed by anything other than my memories of that moment. That moment that felt like an eternity to me was clearly only a few seconds, but they were the most haunting seconds of my life. For a bit of context, I'm a Canadian university student currently living in central Quebec. Not like Montreal or anything, but a very small town bordering a very small city in the middle of nowhere. The landscapes are sort of an emerald dream, with titanic mountains jutting out aggressively, all of which blanketed in a dense forest. I love my town. Everything's within walking distance. Friends, the bar, the lake. It's all great and nearby. So we often hit the town together. No need to drive anywhere or anything. Last night, we decided to have a little bonfire on this little ridge off the side of the lake, which doesn't really provide too much surface area for a bonfire. For this reason, the 10 of us were huddled around a dimly lit campfire instead. Guitar is being played, fine alcohol is being drank, and good times are being had by all. As the night draws on, I've charged myself with keeping the bulk of the fire going. Nobody else is too apt at any sort of camping, or otherwise outdoorsy activities in my group. Up to this point, all was very normal, other than my close friends acting a little off. After our first few, he had ran out and left by himself to go get more. The ridge was out of sight of the road due to the dense forest paths that we used to get to and from it, so he goes and cuts through it alone. When he gets back, he's acting like he had 100 beers. Looked like he wasn't used to his legs. Strangely enough, he had a full case of beer with him, so I assumed he hadn't drank any more. He also wasn't gone for very long at all. Honestly, we drank together often, me and him. I know what he's like drunk, and this was especially unusual. So he's trying to talk to the people, but he just can't say real words. It's as if he was trying to perform all of the accents of normal English speech, but didn't actually understand the words or syntax. Kind of like one of those videos that are meant to show what English might sound like to non-English speakers. As I mentioned before, the fire wasn't providing much in terms of light. So when we'd head off to go grab some firewood, I'd usually jerry-rig my cell phone flashlight to my belt to keep the area in front of me well lit. We do this a few times, and some of the others begin to lose motivation to collect wood, so I take matters into my own hands for the last run of the evening. This brush was completely uncultivated, super thick, very dark. The only discernible paths that were about shoulder width were obstructed by an oddly fallen tree here and there. So I'm yanking at trees, trying to feel for anything dry. Even my phone light was falling behind waist-level foliage. I didn't really have too much lighting. Once I got a handful or so, I figured it'd be good enough for the last burn, so I get the idea to head back. But just as I get this thought, my phone falls straight onto the ground. So of course, it had to land face down, blocking the flash, preventing me from finding the right way. Regardless, I didn't look forward immediately. For some reason, I decided to let the darkness sink in. I had never been in such a dark environment that I was unable to see my hand in front of my face. Even the brightest moonbeams couldn't breach the canopy above. However, as I focus on my surroundings, I quickly realized I was referencing my frame using a subtle glow. It was yellowish, but twisted into a green color the more I concentrated. I was immediately very startled by its lack of movement, yet curious. I hesitantly paced inward, carelessly leaving my phone on the ground. The glow split distinctly into two yellow-green bulbs that were locked onto each other. They're my eyes. My vision is really bad, especially with lighting, so from a distance my eyes will merge the source of light together. For instance, I can't see stars. This caused my curiosity to go nuts. What kind of fat raccoon is trying to stalk me through these bushes? Something was hitting me though. I was terrified. I bore a fear so intense that my stomach began to churn. My curiosity has always outweighed my fears, and this situation was no different. I began to know what it was. It began to know me. There was this very strange bond in that moment that chilled me to the core. I felt a connection to this living thing, but its eyes were pumping fear into my body. The worst mistake I'd ever make is to follow. Nervously, I yelled loud enough to attempt to startle whatever it may have been in this chilling stare down against me at only about a 7 or 8 foot distance. Its absolutely motionless reaction to my help began to chip away at my sanity. Was I staring at 2 elaborately placed lights in the middle of the woods? No, it couldn't be. They had eyes, and this battle cry didn't even make him flinch. Because of that, part of me rationalized that it could not possibly be any animal. It's probably some kind of prank, or a marker for some type of ecology job. So I pressed towards it again, walking as if I knew for sure that this was all to be logically explained. As I closed the gap, my vision began to home in on these lights. Plainly defined ovals, resplendent with the brightest darkness I'd ever felt, when they were legitimately just out of my range of clear vision. The lights, which were waist level before, rose up. They rose as eyes would on a bear standing onto its hind legs, instantly reducing me to a quivering mess. Odd thing is, bears don't have antlers. I haven't ever heard of a moose with piercing eyes that can stand on its hind legs either. As soon as it began straightening up, I was already getting out of there. I just ran. Luckily, I managed to kick my phone out of the dirt and quickly picked it up. The flashlight was still going, making it really easy to spot once I kicked it. Rolling through the woods, illuminating phone now in my hand, I made it back to my campfire completely out of breath. Now, normally I'd spray this story all over my friends, but I knew they'd just think I'd went crazy or hit my head collecting wood. Also, considering I didn't have a bundle of sticks anymore, my shortness of breath was probably a little unjustified. I sat down and noticed that my friend from before was still being very strange, but it seemed like with every passing minute he was adapting more to the conversation and was steadily attempting to contribute more and more. We're all good friends, which is why I find this unusual, considering the fact that he legitimately could not speak English 1 minute, and then within 15 he's practically back to normal. Still, something was off. He was the last to leave the campfire, even after the other guys had pissed it out, and he just stayed there staring at the ashes. After most of us had gotten home, he calls me. An entire minute of silence. The whole time I'm shouting at him to tell me where he is, and that if he's too drunk to get home, I'll go and find him. Disturbingly, he just hangs up. After a cigarette and another half a beer, he calls me back again. This time he's trying to talk like before, but he can't pronounce any words again. He never did touch that case of beer he brought, by the way. Just sat next to him during the whole fire. So I tell him to stop being an idiot and to tell me where he is. He hangs up again, leaving me to figure that he's just drunk, emotional, and that maybe I was just being a little too harsh on him. Honestly though, I was just so shaken up and I needed to confide to somebody about what I had just seen, but he was incapacitated and it frustrated me. After that, I went to bed and I figured he was just being strangely drunk. It was insanely weird to me, but I had a few drinks too and I wasn't really having any of his crap and I figured I'd try to get some sleep. When I wake up in the morning, I have a text from his roommate asking me why he saw him crawl from underneath his car in the driveway this morning. We haven't seen him since, and his roommate said he thought he'd never made it home because he didn't come in. So, what's wrong with my friend? I'm hoping he comes back because if he doesn't, my buddy just got his skin and carjacked by a flesh gate or something. So now I'm scared. Sorry for the long post, I just needed to vent and tell the story properly as I remember it. Update. He came back home around 8:30 p.m. last night looking a little shaken up, but otherwise normal. He seems fine for now. This happened last night, so for the past 2 days, I've been reading a lot about skinwalkers. I've scourged the top posts of all time and read every single story from there, and also the local news for skinwalker stories. I live in NWT. It's the province about Alberta, about 200,000 in population, beautiful in the summer. We're surrounded by the woods and lots of lakes. There's one particular trail people often drive to access said lakes. Anyway, last night I was driving on the trail with a guy friend to find a secluded spot. He recommended V Lake, which was the first lake you access on the trail system. The way it's set up, there's a long narrow dirt road at the right of the highway that you have to drive for at least 20 minutes before you get to the lake itself. The dirt road is surrounded by trees and is riddled with little lakes here and there. It's my favorite lake to drive to, mostly because I love the narrow dirt roads with lots of tall trees. So it's Sunday night and we're the only ones driving. We weren't high or drunk, we were just having fun, listening to music. Then as I was driving, about 10 minutes into the dirt road, an extremely strong smell of rotten flesh filled our noses. This weirded my friend out and made me panic. The first thing that came to my mind was skinwalkers. It was vile and the smell just hit us all of a sudden. The windows were closed and the AC was set to the lowest. The car is clean and nothing there could have caused it. I asked him what he thought of the smell. He said barbecue. I told him there's a current fire ban in effect in the city. That can't be. He agreed and he said it smelled really rotten to him. The smell was strong. It was making me nauseous. I'm now more aware of the woods surrounding us. How it actually makes me feel kind of claustrophobic. How every turn and curve makes me more and more anxious. My gut was telling me something isn't right, and I kept thinking skinwalkers and the stories I've read up for the past 2 days. I was getting more scared by the moment. Then we drove through another curve, and my lights and high beams shone quickly on a person standing inside the mouth of the woods, and that's when I panicked. I asked my friend, "Do you still want to drive down this road?" "Yeah, I don't care," he replied. During this time, I seriously knew something wasn't right and my brain kept screaming at me to turn around. I kept glancing at my mirrors. Frank Ocean's voice wasn't calming me down. I was so scared. I think he saw my discomfort, so he piped up again. "We can turn around if you want." I slammed on my brakes and did a 4-point turn and hightailed it out of there. Once we were back on the highway of the trail, I told him about what I thought of the smell, but not the person I saw in the woods. I didn't want to freak him out. We had a long conversation about it. I knew we shouldn't have, but he kept asking questions because he was curious, so I answered, but tried not to mention its name. Also, while we were there, we were parked at the picnic ground of a lake, and little stones started hitting the driver's side of the truck. A couple would hit every minute or so. It unnerved the crap out of me, but I ignored it. There was no one else in the trail because we didn't hear or see anyone driving. That was kind of weird too. One statement of his that kind of unnerved me was, I think it was trying to lure us further into the woods. So on the way back, I had him drive so I could calm down. I was calmer on the drive back. There were some foxes with glowing eyes in the middle of the road that kind of freaked me out at first, but then I realized they're just foxes. Also saw roadkill by the immediate side of the road that wasn't there before, which was pretty weird. It was about the size of a beaver, but really nothing to panic about, I think. So yeah, this all happened from 1 to 3 a.m. last night. I now really believe in skinwalkers. Just wasn't expecting on encountering one. My uncle, aunt, and all my cousins live in Utah, like 2 states over from me, California. They drive around a lot, especially for family reunions. My uncle often tells all the kids and everyone else a story when we go camping, mostly since someone usually wants to hear it again. He was driving back home alone one night in the summer. He knew the area well and he wasn't worried, but he was still kind of creeped out from, well, driving alone at night. He was in a long road of that sort of sparse, deserty area with the hills and bushes. My uncle then heard a weird noise, like a chirp or something. The way he described it was the first part of the he that Michael Jackson makes, without the second he. It sounds very ridiculous, I know, but unsettling in the cold, dark outdoors. And it seemed clear enough to not have just been creaking metal, or something like that. Obviously, he got a little weirded out by it. He's a lively, tough dude with the company of others, but he hates being alone. My uncle heard it from somewhat far away, but then he started hearing it again, and it was almost ramping up, getting faster. It was also getting slightly louder. He sped up, but it still continued to get closer. He looked to the left outside his window and saw something running almost parallel to his truck, pretty far off the road but inside the bush area, upright like a tall, skinny human. He said it was brown and furry, and it just bothered him. It wasn't horror movie monster scary, but it was something's wrong scary. He heard the moving of leaves. The noise was now basically constant. It sounded different, like a person sounds when they're tired and speak every syllable in one breath of air. The animal thing sort of faded into the plants. The thing was, though, he didn't feel any less scared, since now he feared it was in front of him, and that he would see it clearly on the road, but nothing happened for the rest of the ride. He usually clears out the night with his story. Camping stories are fun, but they're sort of harmless. This one gets everyone creeped out and thinking, something that wouldn't have gone away if he told the story earlier. For a little background on my story, I live in a small town outside of Kansas City, Kansas. But the area I live in has lots of history around it, and there was a lot of Native American activity in the area. My house has a long driveway, and is in the middle of a stand of woods. The woods have been there as long as there's records of the area. When we first moved into our home, everything seemed pretty normal, but after living there a month, that's when abnormal stuff started to happen. Pounding on the roof, animal scratches on our vehicles, and we started finding a lot of dead animals on the property. We even contacted Kansas state game wardens, but couldn't find any evidence of poaching or poisoning, or even the animals getting hit by cars. So after about 2 years of this, my older brother moves back in and brings his dog with him. One night at about 11 p.m., the dog starts whining to be let out. So I put him on the leash and let him walk around the yard. Suddenly, he starts trying to yank me back towards the house. This uneasy feeling washes over me and I notice something that smells like rotting catfish guts. I feel like someone was watching me, so I turn around, and down by our garage, just inside the light, I see this figure. It was about 5 feet tall, hunched over, and it was very pale. It had small, deep, beady eyes and had a deer-like face. A sense of pure terror washed over me. I've never been more scared of anything in my life, and to this day, I've never felt that level of fear. I ran back into the house to wake up my dad and brother. They grab some shotguns and run outside to check it out. All they find are some pretty deep scratch marks on the garage. We contacted the game wardens the next day. I described what I saw and smelled, and they said it was probably a very sick deer that had contracted some sort of illness or something of that sort. Weird stuff kept happening for another 2 or 3 years. Then we had a really bad drought and stuff stopped occurring. So I don't know what the hell I saw that night. I was wondering if anyone had seen or smelled anything similar to that.
So, for the context of this story, this was about 10 years ago. I was about 13 the first time my parents took me and my little brother to Disneyland for the first time, and it literally was the happiest place on earth. Me and my brother, who was only 10 at the time, adored the rides, the fireworks, the food, just the magic in general. It was my favorite family vacation we had ever taken. However, I seemed to get a lot of negative attention. I was tall for my age and already well developed, so I would get stares from older men. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I overheard my dad mention something to my mom about a father with 2 children staring at my ass in the line of a ride. This barely concerned me though, considering where we were at. On the 3rd day of our vacation, my parents were so worn out, they didn't want to go to the park anymore. I begged and pleaded with them to allow me and my brother to head off on our own, and finally, my mother talked my father into allowing us to go and explore Disneyland by ourselves. Taking my brother firmly by the hand, we walked to the park entrance and experienced a newfound sense of glorious freedom as we walked through the gate by ourselves for the first time. It was almost like seeing it all over again in a new light. Like I said, I was completely oblivious to most things since I had grown up in a small town in relative safety. I was a nerd and nobody ever paid attention to me at my middle school, so I didn't expect them to pay attention to me anywhere else. I remember getting in line for Pirates of the Caribbean, and I felt someone else get in line behind me and my brother, and he was standing very, very close, close enough to almost be touching my brother. Since my brother has autism, and I didn't want him freaking out because someone was so close, I decided to play the sacrificial lamb and stepped between him and my brother. However, this just made him step even closer, practically pressing up against my body. I felt uncomfortable, but I chose to ignore him as we got closer to the front of the ride. Stepping into the boat, I stuck my baby brother on the side and slunk into the middle seat. From behind me, I could hear a commotion and someone slid in next to me. The creepy guy who kept pressing up against me. It didn't take him long to continue getting in my personal space, his hand practically touching my upper thigh. I was a shy 13-year-old, and he was a grown-ass man. How the hell was I going to try and keep him off me? He would have crushed me like a bug. So I tried to huddle next to my brother and enjoy the ride. As it went on, the guy's hand went from a relaxed stance to a firm grip, his thumb digging into my skin. I wanted to cry and vomit all at the same time as my oblivious brother watched the animatronic pirates. As the ride was getting to a standstill, the guy finally turns to me and gives me a smile. At least, I think it was a smile. It was super dark on the ride. It could have been a snarl for all I knew. He mentioned something about seeing me and my brother around the park, that we looked like we were lost, and that he could give us a behind-the-scenes tour of the park since he was an off-duty park employee. He said he worked for the Tower of Terror over in California. Heart in my throat and my brother in tow, we got out of the ride and burst onto the busy street. I didn't know